intent and have this hands-on and interactive. The intention is to actually go away with thoughts and ideas and get your minds thinking of how you can get the best out of BCM automation. Certainly the last 1 year has caused, as everyone knows, unprecedented situations where literally you realize that unfortunately people will be down, and you will have situations where you do need automation simply because there are not just enough people to do everything, or we are not able to maintain the focus for different reasons. And all the more clearly, I think over the last 1 year, the entire emphasis has moved towards digitization and automation. So in that sense, this is very well timed. So my role was the easy part, to be honest, just to welcome you all, to say thanks. I think it's our team who've been involved with you, who's done the hard work, and of course, Paul and Marzia in terms of the session they're going to present. So that's all really I have to say. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great session. Please keep your questions ready. What we did want this time is not to be a standard webinar where literally someone just starts speaking and you get 2 minutes at the end. To me, I think the key issue is treat this like just a virtual meeting. And in a meeting, you're all in the same place. You're all interacting as a team. You get to ask what you want. So literally, if I go back to my youth, often you have books saying everything you wanted to know, but were not able to ask. Well, this is your chance. Everything you wanted to know, but you're able to ask. So please keep those questions ready. It's interactive. It's all of us together. And with that, I'll quiet down. I'll shut off my camera, and I'm just going to hand it over to Marzia and Paul. So over to you guys. And the rules of the session are yours. So feel free. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dheeraj. That was a fantastic introduction. And you've stolen my thunder. You've said everything I wanted to say from a housekeeping point of view. So you're right. So we were chatting just before everybody arrived. Paul and I have thoroughly enjoyed putting this together, actually. So I'm really hoping that it is not just useful, but also, spark some conversation. We've got 3 hours today, which is a far cry from the original 25 minutes that we had a couple of weeks ago. So I'm really hoping that what happened a couple of weeks ago whet your appetites to be here today. But as Dheeraj said, please don't hesitate to ask questions. There are, there is the chat facility, but there are also, just interrupt us while we're talking. I'll try and keep the pace going, but not too frenetic. And hopefully we have some fun and have some engaging conversation along the way. So I'll crack on.
Marzia, before you start,
yes.
could I ask a couple of things? Chantal, is it possible that you could silence the beeps when people come and go? I think people will be coming and going fairly regularly during the session, and it's really distracting when you're trying to speak to have that going on. If there's any way you can just suppress that noise, that would be marvelous.
That's a good point. We'll take a look. Yeah.
Thank you. It's part of the setup controls in Zoom. Sorry, Marzia, back to you.
No worries. Thanks, Paul. I am actually impressed at the number of beeps and people that are attending that can take 3 hours to spend with us today. So what I'll do today, just in some level of detail, you should all be able to see my screen, is actually to do what I didn't do during the conference in very much detail because there just wasn't enough time. So I'll do a little bit of an introduction as to who we are and why we're here today. So my name is Marzia Haenen, as you can see. I have spent the last few years implementing software solutions specifically for business continuity and resilience programs. And they've varied between bespoke systems that have been built directly for the clients, in-house and managed in-house, all the way through to the implementation of big enterprise software solutions. And that's actually why I've asked, well, why Paul is here today, because I've spent the last couple of years really working with Paul implementing continuity logic into very large financial institutions in the UK. And I'm hoping that between the two of us, we're able to bring some insights to you. So I don't want to, I'm calling them lessons learned today, but really it's just a discussion as to, things that we've come across, hurdles that we've managed to get through in automating programs of various sizes. And as the brief said in what Iraj and his team circulated, we're really here to look at why you should automate your program. So what's the advantage behind automating any program? What are the benefits that it could bring? And how you actually go about doing that. So how do you even start that conversation? I know, Diraj, you circulated a couple of questions. I'm hoping that we'll be able to touch on those today. If I forget or if I don't manage to touch them, please can you remind me, because there were some really intriguing questions that were asked on that email. And I'll just repeat again, I mean, if you wouldn't mind staying off mute while we are talking, or if you don't have any questions to ask, but please don't feel shy about raising your hand or asking any questions while we go along. Okay, so we'll kick this off. It's really early in the UK, so hopefully this wakes us all up. As a poll, let's do a poll. There's a poll within Zoom that will be introduced. And really, I want to, let me just move that to the side. I'm asking just a very simple question. Right now, before we even started talking, how do you describe your attitude towards automation of business continuity and resilience programs? So, are you already using significant amounts of software and automation, and you're really just here to polish that knowledge up? Are you using some automation, but you're not quite sure if you need to go to the next level? Are you looking to automate, but you just don't have the budget or the resource to do it? Do you not feel that you need to automate anything at this time, and you're just here to listen in and to learn something new? Interestingly, are you, oh, hang on, let's just do this. Sorry, the poll on my screen is not the same as the poll on the actual, so let's just go with the poll on Zoom, my mistake, sorry. So let me just go back to those questions. It is very early. Are you already using significant amounts of automation? You're not sure if you need more. You don't have the budget. You're planning on implementing, or you don't feel that you need to implement anything at all. Okay. And while that's going on, I know Paul will interrupt me when we get to when we get some there are answers coming in thick and fast. But when we get to a point, Paul, just interrupt me and we can chat about those answers.
Also, so, Paul, sorry, Marzia, I just tried to remove the sound when people come in and out, but I guess once the session is started, it doesn't allow the edits.
Oh, I see.
I
so
see.
It's a learning for next time.
Yes,
but valid point, and I totally take your point. At least we could have had it at a lower sound level. But I think we're stuck with it for now.
Okay, thanks for trying.
Thank you. I'm sure most of the attendees are in already by now, so we'll don't worry, we'll manage. So while those results are coming in, just also a bit of an icebreaker. Here's a question that gets asked all the time, especially when we start talking about automation, but also when we started talking about the title of this particular presentation. Business continuity and resilience programs are the same thing. Now, this is it's a question that's asked all the time, and it raises all sorts of eyebrows. I thought, let's just get it out of the way for the purposes of this presentation, just so that we start on an even footing, right? The second bit is that we're only here to talk about automating business continuity. Now, both of those statements for today are false, right? It doesn't matter how you label your program. It doesn't matter how complex or mature your program is. It doesn't matter whether you're focusing on business continuity or whether you're trying to evolve it into the resilience programs and the regulatory demand that's coming through, as we're seeing in the UK and Europe at the moment. Okay. Automation is applicable regardless. So if you've got any questions, don't worry about the programs that you're running. Ask us questions about anything that you want to. Automation applies to every single stage of your program, and it also applies to every single point along the journey to mature that program. Okay. Right. Second, this is the last time we're going to do this in case any of you are annoyed. Business continuity and resilience programs are not thought of active contributors to an organization's competitive advantage. True or false? Now, in the past, some of us may have been in programs that were labeled as compliance or tick box or tick box exercises within the organization, where you're there to fulfill an audit purpose, and there's not very much that you do that feels like you're contributing to the overall strategy or the overall competitiveness of that organization, right? We are seeing a big change in that. And the last year, as Raj pointed out in his introduction, the last year has certainly shone a spotlight on resilience and BC programs, because they can no longer sit in the background. They can no longer just be compliance exercises. In fact, the demands on BC and resilience programs are suddenly so extreme that teams are finding that they're having to do things that they've never done before, and they're having engagement with stakeholders they've never had before. So again, we know, we all know, and everybody on this call, I'm sure, if you're here and you're interested, know that effective programs can contribute to strategic decision making. Okay? The point about automating and why we're bringing automation into this is because we need to make those programs more efficient. We need to be able to remove those commodity tasks, remove the daily grind from the programs, and add some real computational power behind those programs to make that decision making even more powerful. All right, Paul, how are we doing with those polls?
I think the poll is doing very well. So 17 out of 24 people have answered. Probably you and I are included in that. So that's probably the vast majority of people who are going to answer have answered. So yes, can you see the results there?
I can. So shall I let me finish what I'm doing, and then we can go and have a look at those. Sure. Okay. Yeah. So you'll see these icons floating. Anybody who was on the call a couple of weeks ago will see this is quite familiar. In fact, the presentation itself will have the same look and feel as you saw a couple of weeks ago. There's just a lot more content in them. And these two icons speak specifically about this one, about customer engagement. So why do we do business continuity and resilience? Right? If we had to distill that into two major factors, the first one is ensuring that customer-facing services are resilient. Okay, so what if we could put our hands up and say we can make sure, or we can prevent operational failures from impacting revenue and reputation, or we have done our best to ensure that any impact is as minimal as possible. Okay, the second one is good old crisis management. Right, if something happens, you know, we can recover quickly. So we're not allowing failure or allowing the inability to respond to something to position organizations negatively against competition. Okay. Now you'll see these two icons coming in on a regular basis during today, where we're trying to make it, we're trying to make obvious, we're trying to draw the link together between what it is we're trying to do from an automation point of view, and how doing that will contribute to a more effective or a more powerful program. Right, and just for anybody that's joining, I can see there are some additional people joining the call. There is a poll that's open. If you're welcome to join it as well. But let's just go through it. And I'm glad to actually see the results that have come through on this particular one, that you're planning on implementing software automation. That's always an exciting stage in any project, is that initial thought, that initial request for proposal or gathering of requirements. I'm pleased to see that we've got a couple of people who are already using significant amounts of automation. I'm hoping that we can then add to that. And I'm really hoping that you can contribute to the conversation. We'll be sharing some war stories if we can towards the end of this. But, you know, please jump in and share any of your experiences as well. And it's interesting that you don't feel that you need to automate anything at this time. There are 3 respondents on that. And by the way, this is anonymous in case anybody was worried about it. But I'm hoping, not that I can change your mind on that. That's not my job today. But I'm wondering if by the end of this, you feel as if there is some opportunity to automate some part of your program. Paul, I think we can just leave that open, that poll, seeing as there's new people coming in.
Sure.
All right. Okay. So let's talk about the agenda. I did a bit of an introduction beforehand. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to pass over to Paul in the first instance. So as I mentioned before, I've partnered with Continuity Logic on the introduction of Continuity Logic as an enterprise business continuity resilience software solution in 2 large financial institutions in the UK. And that's been my focus for the last 5 years to do that. And so Paul is going to do a demonstration at the moment, specifically of his software and how it can deliver a traditional BCM resilience program. These are things that I'm hoping that you recognize. I do just want to say from at the very start, right, this is not a software plug. This is not a way to increase sales for Paul. I'm sure he'll agree with me. It's just I've worked with Continuity Logic, and I understand it, and I know how it works, and I know that it can answer just about every single resilience or BC question we've ever thrown at us. Right, we will then be looking at three concepts, and these concepts, if you were at the session a couple of weeks ago, will be familiar. We're going to be going into far more detail into each of these. So we've distilled all automation questions into 3 major buckets, if you will. The first is workflow, right? How do you hand tasks over? How do you ensure that those small commodity tasks that are taking up time in your team, how do you deliver this without having to employ an army of people to do it for you? And that, Diraj, is what you spoke about right at the beginning. We have got increasing pressure on our teams, and we just don't have enough hands anymore to deliver everything to everybody that's interested in BCM resilience. Right, we'll be looking at rules and triggers. How do you actually get the software to do the heavy lifting for you? How do you get it to watch your program for you and tell you when things need to be done? And then the last thing, which, Paul will tell you is always where I land up speaking the most about, that's reporting dashboards and visualizations. How do you make sure that all that data that you're collecting can be brought to the surface and made available to various stakeholders, analyzed and understood in an easy and good looking way? There's no point in having data in a database if you can't actually get it out. So that's what we'll be doing today. We'll be going through each one of these with a discussion, some demonstration again of how software can actually do these things for you. It's not just me talking about things that can't actually be done with software. And then we'll walk into some lessons learned and hopefully some really good engaging conversation with you. And I'm hoping that is I'm hoping that it's entertaining. It's certainly, as I said, it certainly entertained Paul and me putting this all together over the past couple of weeks. Right, so Paul, on that note, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Marzia, much appreciated. I've received a message from Chantal to say that not everybody can see the poll. I'm going to close the poll now, actually. It's been going for 12 minutes and 24 out of 27 people have answered the poll. So I'm assuming that everybody, maybe except one, has been able to see it. So unless somebody is desperate to respond to the poll and hasn't yet been able to find it on their window, I'm going to close this, Chantal, unless you want me to do otherwise. Okay, I'm assuming that's agreement. So the poll is ending now, and there are some fascinating results there, Marzia, which we might go back over later, as you say, and I think you've just covered really the important points from that. So polling is now closed, and I'm going to share the results. So I'm expecting that you're now seeing a sharing poll results in front of you. As Marzia said, these are anonymous. Nobody knows who said what to which question, but I think it's an interesting set of results. So I'm going to park that on one side now. Okay, so let me now share my window. I'm actually going to turn my camera off because I'm going to be looking hard at the screen and focusing on what I'm looking at and then talking about that. So forgive me while I turn that off. Return to that view. Share screen. Right. Are you seeing my screen, Marzia?
I am. Thank you, Paul.
Fantastic. Okay. Right. So as Marzia said, I was given very clear instructions not to sell our software in this situation. So this is not a pitch. What I am seeking to do here is to describe the functionality in the software, which of course will be present in other software solutions. It's very hard for me to know which product has which capabilities. I know which ours has, but I will take you through the capabilities of the software. One thing just to say up front, please, is because I can't look at a chat window at the same time as I'm demonstrating the software, if anybody puts their hand up or wants to know a specific question while I'm going through it, I won't see that. So maybe you could type the question and then Marzia, maybe you could put that question to me, or maybe if it's desperately urgent, you just maybe just come onto the voice and just use your voice and ask me the question. But I think I'll probably cover most of the questions during the presentation anyway, what we've got here. So let me start by saying that the way that certainly the continuity logic software platform works, and I'm sure a number of others, is to cover a wide range of what we call enterprise risk management functionalities. But what we are talking about today primarily is going to be the BC and DR planning, the business impact analysis, the application impact analysis. We'll be looking and touching on tests and exercises and other components, but in order to keep it within a reasonable time frame, we've had to limit the scope of what we're looking at here. And what I'm going to start by doing is taking you through an overview of how the software interface functions in the continuity logic solution. So what you're seeing here is somebody who is logging into the system. Here we have a woman called Sarah Maddox, who's the user. She's using a web browser. The software that we have is either available as a SaaS model from servers in both Europe and the States, or for many of our clients in the Gulf, it's deployed on premise on their own servers. It would work in exactly the same way as what you're seeing here. So Sarah is logging in through often a single sign-on process, but sometimes not. And this will take her in the Google Chrome browser or another similar modern browser into her starting page, which we always call the Enterprise Resilience Center. That's our starting point. Our clients can call this, in actual fact, whatever they want for their organization. Many of our clients brand this whole page here to make it look more like their own website or more like an in-house solution. And what you'll see here is a number of components on this interface, which I will just explain to start with, just so you see how this whole thing hangs together. First of all, this first page has got a number of elements on it. You can see we had some tasks at the top up here. We've got some identified risks here. We've got some issues that individuals might be meant to be addressing there. And then at the top here, we're back up to my BIAs and my plans. And this is one of just one of a number of tabs here. This is the user dashboard. There's also a number of others, which I will touch on briefly now, but we'll see some of these later on when we go into the more detailed discussion, which is addressing the specific 3 topics that Marzia highlighted earlier. So you've got the normal hamburger menu, the top left there, where you can hide or open the menu to make it easier to follow. You've got the menu options down the left-hand side there. What you've then got on the top right there is a number of aspects which can be controlled by the user. So one of them here is translating the language of the home page or what you're viewing into a different selected language. So that's an example of that there. You've also got the ability to change the way the interface looks and feels using what we call skins. This is to help organizations to brand it most closely to them. And you can, if you wish, give users access to their own details in the system. So here we're looking at address information, location information, phone information, etc. That's something that wouldn't normally be done. That's normally synchronized with an HR database. And so you don't need to ask users to enter their information. And then finally here, we've got under this sort of section at the top right here, we've got account settings, and account settings are for 2-factor authentication, changing password and other security questions. So that's the way that the interface works. So if we just go back to the starting point here, we'll just see 1 or 2 things happening, and you'll see how the system operates. What you've got next is program controls. These are ways that you can engage with the system to understand where your program is currently at. And this is something we are going to look at. One of the points that Marzia mentioned about making sure that you've got workflow in control. One of the key points of today, we're going to come back and look at program controls. Because a lot of this is about understanding where are we in our plan approval process. It's a big part of workflow is to ensure that you're on top of that. So this sort of dashboard is important for that. The resilience roll-up report is an example of a report. Again, this relates to workflow. What this is showing you is a list of all the plans across the organization, maybe across the different departments in the organization, and it's showing their approval status and their completion status. Those are two actually different things, which we'll come back to later and talk about. You've got the DR roll-up report. This is showing you for different applications and application tiers. Do we understand the application tier? Do we understand the criticality? And if we want, we can drill in and look at the details behind that software application, which is, of course, typically an important dependency. And then we have program analytics. This is for more advanced visualizations and the ability to drill into the data. This, in actual fact, is an integration here with Power BI. We also have integrations with Tableau and Click and Cognos. So there's a variety of ways that our users can interrogate the information that they gather through their BCM program. And that's going to become very relevant as we continue on our presentation today. So there we are, back again at the beginning. Let me go now to the next view. And I think the important point to make here is that a modern business continuity software solution is mobile enabled, entirely mobile enabled, because so many times now we're not sitting at a desk using a laptop computer. We're maybe using an iPad or an iPhone, or even in some cases now people are using, of course, the Apple Watch. So what you need is something which is able to be used 100% on any size of mobile device. And we address that in two ways. We have specialist apps for Android and for iOS. And we also enable that anything that's performed in the system on a full screen can equally be performed on a small screen. Let's just show an example of that here. So here we have a sort of a mock-up of an in fact, this is my phone. It's an iPhone 7, a little bit old these days. But what you've got here is our system active within the window of the iPhone frame. So if you see here, you'll see that the controls that would normally be filling a screen, you just have the screen purposed in a different way, which lays out the information in a way which is usable on a small screen. So if you wish, you could perform a BIA on an iPhone. I wouldn't recommend it. It's a little bit fiddly, tapping away with fingers on a screen, but you could do it. So anything that can be done on the big screen can be done on a mobile device. Right, let me end that there. Let me just talk next about some design concepts. So now we've got the idea of how the software in general works. Let's just talk about how the software would be configured to suit the individual organization's requirements. And the first thing that you would do is that you would build an organizational hierarchy or a structure. And this all depends on how you want your business continuity or resilience program to be managed. An example here is we have a company at the top here. We have then divided it maybe by region for a large geographically dispersed company. That would be a common way of doing it. You then may have divisions within each of these regions. In this case, you've got manufacturing and operations. And then within each division, you may have departments. Now, whether you have divisions, business units and departments, whether you call them something completely different, whether you don't have geographic regions, you just have all your organizations in one location, you have a different hierarchy, that doesn't matter. The principle I'm saying here is that however your organization is organized and structured, you would reflect that in the design of the system. So when you're asking someone to do a plan for a particular part of your business, that will map how your organization is structured. I think that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that you are then decisions that you would make about the use of your software around these different concepts. First of all, where is your BIA going to be conducted? You conduct a BIA on a business service, on an organizational unit, such as those that we have here? Or is it indeed a BIA on a process? So you do a BIA on management accounts and a BIA on a particular manufacturing process? That design is all open, and we'll come back to that a little bit later within the software to look at how BIAs are conducted and where they are conducted. The second thing is, where do you hold your plans? Do you have a plan for a process, or do you have a plan for part of the organization? Do you say, this is the business continuity plan for the finance department, or do you have a separate plan for each of 2, 3, 4 key processes that finance conducts, or a combination of the two? Again, however you want to structure that, those are decisions that would be taken at the beginning of the software deployment. The same sort of questions apply for a risk assessment. And then finally, you would design the way that your system is going to be automated. This is such a big part of what Marzia is talking about today. And so what you're looking at here is, how are responsibilities that you assign going to flow through the organization? If I want somebody to complete a plan, how do I remind them to do it? How do I chase them if they don't do it? Who then, when they have done it, approves it? And how is all that workflow structured? How much time do I allow? And at what point do I start to escalate it? That automation design is really the power behind all systems of this nature. It's trying to make sure that things happen on schedule and that you can report on those. And therefore, the design decisions that you make up front are important to make sure you're reflecting your organization rather than the wishes of a software developer. Now, the last thing I'm going to show in terms of diagram, and I'm going to come back to this diagram a few times during the course of this demonstration, because it's really important to understand the out-of-the-box way in which we have approached this. And I have to explain this to you because you may have a different approach. And I want to explain how you can accommodate, or we can accommodate, different approaches. So the key to this, the most important part, let me just turn on my, yes, so it's always visible. The key to this is this main cycle here is program delivery. So if you're in a business continuity program, you would typically perform an impact assessment on each of the parts of your organization for which you're conducting a BIA. And you would gather from that the proposed recovery time objectives for each part of your organization. And things that the system, things that the software are doing are marked in black. So that's a software stage. What you would then do from a professional point of view, so the items in blue are professional judgments. You would look at those proposed recovery time objectives and check whether you thought they were appropriate. And this is important because if you're asking individuals around your organization to fill in a business impact assessment, they may be answering in a way that you don't think is the most accurate. And therefore, what you need to do is to be able to look at the answers that are being given and use your professional judgment, which of course most people who are filling these in locally won't have, to decide are those appropriate and validate those impacts and recovery time objectives. When you've done that, you would then map your dependencies against each of the business impact assessments that you've done for, let's say you're doing one per department. What software applications does that department need? What suppliers do they use? Which buildings do they require? How many desks do they require in those buildings? These are what we call the dependencies. And this is the way that a program starts to be built to create that level of resilience, because you know how you're going to replace those different dependencies, are they to fail. You would then align the BIA dependencies and RTOs. And what we mean by this is that if you have said that a particular department needs to be back in action after 8 hours, you can't afford for it to be out of action for 8 hours, and you find that it has 3 software applications that it must use, but the recovery time objective for those are 24 hours, then you need to communicate that information with the IT department, and you need to establish a channel of communication whereby you know how that is going to be aligned. And this alignment of dependencies and recovery time objectives is a crucial part of the professional judgment applied and the diplomacy and discussion required within an organization to bring that about. And what we provide is the reports and the visualizations to support that discussion. We show where the gaps exist, and we'll be looking at that as we go through this session. Having done this work, you can then build your recovery strategies and workarounds. So how do we work around the problem? And how at the same time as we're working around it, are we going about recovering a particular process or a business service or a department in the organization? When you've done all that, you've got plans ready to publish. This is what we're going to do. We've gone through the business continuity, BIA and planning cycle. We know what our recovery strategies are, and therefore we can publish the plans. You would then typically test and exercise those plans because you want to learn, have we done this well, or should we be able to fine-tune that? You would therefore go through a test and exercise cycle, and then your professional judgment would be applied to look at the results. What did we learn? What do we need to know and incorporate into our cycle for next time around? And hence the arrow looping right back here and plugging in at the beginning again. And of course, business continuity and operation resilience is a program rather than a project. So it cycles round typically every 12 months, but that's open to interpretation by different organizations. So that would be your primary cycle. Now, a few things just to add, and then I think the whole picture becomes clear. Some people within the business continuity and operation resilience program will inject a risk mitigation phase. So having mapped the dependencies and understanding what those are, they would then go through an asset process risk assessment, apply risk mitigations, and this forms a positive loop here. And then this post-mitigation work feeds into what are the best recovery strategies and workarounds, having applied our risk mitigation. So if we see that a building is in dreadful risk of being flooded, then maybe the first thing we should go about doing is protecting that if we've identified that risk as part of this process. And that would change our recovery strategies because we now have a lower chance of the flooding taking place. So that's the first thing to add to the main cycle. The second thing to add is this process here, which is not only program setup, but it's also the automation and ongoing synchronization into the system. So here we've embedded our organization structure. We've already talked about that. We've embedded our process information. So if we're doing process-based BIAs, and we may have hundreds of processes, those may be stored in an external system. And rather than keep them up to date in that system and keep them up to date separately in your operational resilience system, you might have those synchronized. So the gray represents a synchronization process. And then here you can see the dependencies, the applications, the vendors, etc., would also be automatically synchronized into your map dependencies section. This is often coming from a solution such as ServiceNow, which is very popular for application management. And therefore the data in ServiceNow would be synchronized with the solution. So what this is doing is taking away the need to rekey information that somebody has already entered into another system. In principle, if the information you want in your business continuity program has already been entered somewhere else in the organization by somebody else, then don't do it again. It's more work, and also it is just introducing the possibility of error. So the idea there is to make sure that you are entirely clear that any data that's already been entered will be used by you in this system by an automatic synchronization. And then the final step to show you here is this automation and control. So sitting over all of this, all of the steps that people have to go through, all of the actions that you're expecting people to do, and there may be dozens or hundreds of people across your organization who would be contributing to this overall program, you have this automation and control sequence, which again is a major part of Marzia's discussion today. What is the update approval cycle? So how often do you want people to update information and perform tasks? What risk controls do you have in place? And how are you going to monitor those approvals and controls? That's the professional judgment in the blue there to make sure that everything is following the right course. So that is the program design and flow at a high level. Now, as far as our software is concerned, if you want to reorganize this sequence, you can do that. We just drag and drop things. I'm not going to show you that today because it would be way too much detail for today's discussion. But if you decide that you want to do things in a different order to this, very easy to do. And at each step, what information you want to gather and how you want it to be processed, again, the way our software works is that that can be changed for each organization. So one company may want to store 3 pieces of information about a process. They think that's enough. And any more than that would be asking people to do too much work. Others may want to store 20 pieces of information about a process. Both of those organizations have their own right to want that information. We would often discuss it with our clients to make sure that it sort of makes sense from a processing point of view, and that we're not replicating work for them, or we're not expecting them to replicate work. But however organizations want to conduct each of these steps, then we would add that information to enable that to happen. So there you go. That's the program design and flow. So let's now just talk a little bit about back to some practical examples of how all this looks. And what I'm going to do is show you now an individual who is going to be asked to basically enter the information in a plan. So James Chilton, he's a fictitious man. James Chilton, this is the photograph of a model from the finance department of our organization. We've got a fictitious organization here called Carlyle Investments. We're using a financial services example, but it really applies just the same to any type of organization: manufacturing, retail, government, banking, all the same in terms of the way that the data would flow. May gather different pieces of information, of course, because they do very different jobs, but in terms of the program flow, it will be the same. So this gentleman here, James Chilton, he's being tasked to do this piece of work. And what he will do is he will be part of a workflow, and we're going to talk about workflow later, as you know, but an important part of workflow is prompting people to do things. And here we have an automatically generated email, which basically is going from the business continuity manager, by going in her name, to James Chilton. And it's basically saying, you said you'd do this. This is why we need you to do it. This is where we want you to go to do it. Will you please do it now? That's what this email is saying in a very polite way. And of course, you would design your own email per organization. And you would also decide how long do you wait before you chase James if he hasn't done it. And when he has done it, who do you ask to check his work and approve it? And that can be a complicated and lengthy process, or it can actually be very short. And it depends on the organization. But this is an important part of any request for people in your organization to do work, is the workflow, and reminding them to do it. So having said that, we have now logged into the system in the same way that we did in the first little clip that we saw, whereby Sarah Maddock logged into the system. James Chilton has now logged into the system. You can see his icon here in the top right-hand corner. And what we're looking at here is he is in the finance plan. So his menu is a lot more straightforward now. We don't want to confuse him with lots of different options and things that he could do. We want to restrict what he can do because we only want him to do one thing. And that is once a year, we want him to come here and complete the planning information and BIA information, which I'll come on to second, for his particular part of the business, which is the finance department. And you can see we're asking him here to complete a number of tabs. And the first tab we're asking him to complete is the department information. And this is where we have key relevant data about his finance department, which we ask him to enter. A couple of points to raise here. First of all, we are very keen, and I think any system would say something similar, very keen on the idea of really driving through help for individuals. So wherever someone is only going to come back once every few months into the software, they will have forgotten what to do. So we have made this system whereby you can write an essay if you want under this little information tag, and you can have information tags wherever you want across the system, and that will describe in as much detail as you think you need to what you want the person to do in this particular part of the system and why. So for the description, we're saying list the primary activities of your department, etc., etc., etc. So that's an important point to raise here. The second thing I wanted to raise while we're at this point is this plan completion status here. You can see it's just gone down from 100 to 75%. The plan completion is based upon which items across this entire plan does each client of ours want to include in what they define as being complete. Now, if they're being exacting and there are 50 things you're expecting to somebody to complete here, complete is when they've done all 50. Other organizations are more forgiving and may say, okay, we'll take the top 10, and provided they've entered, all of those top 10, we'll call that, define that as being complete. That's up to each individual organization. But what we've done here is we've taken it away, and once we replace that name again, you can see the plan completion goes back to 100% again. This is really important for understanding, as a business continuity program owner, where you are in terms of the completion and updates of your business continuity plans. Of course, if these are being completed in spreadsheets, then you have no idea where people are. They may not have even opened the email that you sent the spreadsheet in yet. And so you may be well behind the curve and you just don't know it. This is the way of making sure you're on top of things and not having to chase people for updates until you see there's a problem. I think that's a key part of the workflow process. The next tab here, I'm not going to race through these tabs, otherwise we could spend all day on this. This is where we have some call lists. Who do we want to contact in certain eventualities if there is an incident declared? And this is where we store our call list. These can be manual call lists where one person calls a few people, then those few people all call other people, or it can be integrated with an emergency notification software product. This is our process information. Now, I'm going to come back to this when we come to the business impact assessment. Here you can see that the finance department has 3 business processes, or 3 that it wants to include in this planning process: Treasury Clearinghouse, Revenue Collection, and Payment Pre-authorization. Now, I'm going to describe in a few minutes as to where we recommend or enable our clients to perform BIAs. In this case, the impact assessment is not going to be done at a department level. The impact assessment is going to be done against each process. And I'm highlighting this because I'm going to come back to this that you're seeing here a little bit later. Next is resource requirements. Resource requirements, what this is saying is, as a department, what staff, external dependencies, vital records, etc., do we depend upon? And this is where these department level resource requirements are defined. We also have a separate set of process level resource requirements, which we store against each process. That's the way this particular example is working. Attachments. Do we need for our department recovery plan to have documents in our plan? We decided we do. We need a map of the recovery center because we're going to go to that recovery center. We need to find our way around. And because we're using a third party for this, we want to have the copy of the contract to hand so we can turn up at the door and say, here's our contract. We've got a right to 50 desks in this recovery center. Here's proof. So that's a couple of reasons as to why you would find it very useful to attach documents. You've then got a history of the plan review and revision history. This is really showing that the people have done the right things at the right time. And then we've got tests and exercises. I'm not going to go into this, but this is where you would store a lot of information, if appropriate, about tests and exercising that you've discussed, the tests and exercises that you have conducted. And this is where you would learn your lessons and feed that back into the planning process. And then finally, application risk. What application risk is doing is telling us something that's a little bit advanced that I'm actually not going to go into here. But the principle here is making sure that we know the current exposure of different processes in the departments, and this is something that you would track. But this will make more sense when we've gone through a subsequent stage in this demonstration. Okay, and then
Paul, if I could interrupt you there. Sorry, there's a question from Hussein asking if there's any limits to the number of processes you can add.
None at all. No, you could have 1 million if you wanted. It's entirely dependent on the hosting capability. And I haven't mentioned this, but the way our software, if the software is hosted on your own premises, then it would only be limited by the computing power that you were to dedicate to this. And we could obviously advise you on that. If you were utilizing our SaaS solution, then we scale that according to the number of the demand, the data and user demand. So again, that would be quite feasible, no restriction. Now, the final thing I wanted to show here, if that answers the question, is that what we've been looking at so far is the use of tabs to go through different pieces of information. This is an example of not using tabs, but using a wizard, whereby people can step through item by item. The advantage of using a wizard, and this is powerful, where you want people to fill in one tab before they're able to progress to the next tab. And a wizard is very powerful for that. There are some cases where you want people to be able to jump around from tab to tab, in which case you wouldn't use a wizard. But wizards are very popular because they hold people's hands and say, fill in this page first. When you've done this, that page will turn green, then you can go to the next page. The next page, when you're on it, will show as blue, and the ones that you haven't yet done will show as gray. There's another question there, Marzia.
No, I think that was just somebody coming into the meeting room.
Just a random ping. Okay. So that is what I wanted to show you as far as the department level planning is concerned. Let's now move on to the business impact assessment. Now, before I show you how the software handles this, I'd just like to talk conceptually about business impact assessments, because there's a lot of discussion and debate about how and where should a business impact assessment be conducted. And let me take you through in 2 or 3 minutes. I actually did a 20-minute session on this at the core conference 2 or 3 weeks ago. So this is actually a big topic, but I'm going to whiz through it here just to give the key concepts. This is a floor diagram of a floor in an office, just a sample, the idea of a floor in an office. And this is a scale of light touch business impact assessment all the way through to high value, but high value requires more work. And we step through 4 different approaches to a business impact assessment. First is you do a business impact assessment for the loss of each of your departments. The advantage of that is you only have a limited number of departments. You have a lot less departments than you will have processes. So that's easier to do. You're doing a lower number of BIAs. That's the advantage, which is why it's light touch. The disadvantage is that you're losing a lot of the detail of what these departments actually do. And can you really treat each department the same across the whole department? That's probably not appropriate. So the next step is department plus activities. Here, the department owner would highlight what he or she believed to be the key activities that they conduct, the most important activities that are most likely to deviate from the overall recovery plan for the entire department. So if we're building a plan to recover finance, we also want to make sure that we take special account of management accounts and accounts payable. That's the department plus activities approach. The next approach, which is today by far the most popular, is the process approach. And here you say, okay, it's interesting that we have a number of processes done in the finance department, but what's most important is what are those processes? And therefore, we're going to conduct a business impact assessment for each of these 4 processes, one for payroll, one for management accounts, one for payment processing, and one for accounts payable. And because that's where the detail of the work is involved. And each of these may have different recovery time objectives and different recovery strategies as to how they will get back to work again. And those need to be understood to have proper, full recovery strategies. Now, I've been involved in software for business continuity since 2004. So that's 17 years, isn't it? It's a long time. And for more than one solution. And what I can say is that to start with, this was, in 2004, this was the most popular approach by a long way. People were starting to talk about this approach and in some cases trying to do it, but this is the most popular approach. There was then a transition to this is a halfway house, department plus activities. But we've now pretty much, I would say 80% of individual organizations that I converse with are wishing to do a process-based BIA. And the other 20% are not wanting to head this way, they're wanting to head this way. And let me finish with the final BIA option, which is the business service approach. Now, this has been driven by, in many ways, by the UK regulators of the banking sector, but it's absolutely being adopted. We're seeing massively in the United States. So I think it's one of those situations where the UK has punched above its weight. It's created a methodology which seems to have cross-industry applicability. It doesn't matter whether you're a manufacturer or a bank, the same applies, and cross-geography. And I think different territories, different continents, different countries and states are bringing their own regulations into play, but they're all based around very similar concepts. And the concept is the idea, as Marzia will talk about, of a customer journey. And so what you're saying here is that here is an individual who engages with my business. And individuals don't engage with your processes. They don't know what your processes are. What they engage with is a sequence of processes, which is a customer journey. Now, in this example, the journey example is, imagine this is an online retailer. And this online retailer is encouraging a customer, of course, to buy as much as they can. So when they come into the order selection process on the website, that's probably owned by marketing. And marketing thinks, what can I do to get this person to put as many things into their basket as possible? And we want to deliver big orders rather than lots of little ones. So that's a marketing process. When the person's chosen what they want to buy, they then have to pay for it. That's be a credit card transaction, no doubt under the remit of the finance department in one way or another. And when that payment is being processed, when the credit card transaction is being cleared, it goes straight across to logistics for them to pack the order, put it in cardboard boxes, and then deliver it to the customer's door. Now, I'm saying here there are 3 processes. Frankly, for a customer journey like that, there are probably 20 processes that are being conducted across the organization, but I'm keeping it simple. And so what the business service assessment says is that you shouldn't be worrying about your individual processes first. You need to worry about those second. First, you need to worry about how resilient is the entire customer journey. And therefore, this is becoming now the impact assessment that is very much rising in popularity. So the wave has really flowed down here. It is now 80% process, but the pickup is now moving across to business service. Certainly in financial services in the UK, this is becoming the dominant requirement, but we're also seeing that rising in the States and in other parts of the world as organizations understand the power of this. And so these are the 4 different ways that you can do a BIA. The one I'm actually talking about here, because it's the most popular still, is going to be the process-based business impact assessment. But I will, when I've done that, refer back to a business service impact assessment. So here we are now. We're back in the planning mechanism that we were just showing earlier for the finance department. And I mentioned to you that we were conducting the BIAs here against processes. So I'm going to go back to those processes here. And this is where, because we're doing a process-based BIA in this example organization, this is where we are going to do our impact assessment. And I'm going to do an impact assessment now. Before I move on, Marzia, are there any questions I should address about what I've just said before we move on?
There is one, Paul, but
yes.
You can answer. So it's to do with the embedment of emergency notification systems. So I think
Yes.
perhaps if we leave that till the end,
Okay,
you can then spend some more time. I won't forget to ask you.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've now come into the list of processes that we have within our finance department, and this is where we're going to do our impact assessment. And we're going to do it for the revenue collection process. And when we call that process up, we now have another series of tabs around the impact assessment. This is because we're doing 2 things on this process level information. We're performing our impact assessment, and we're also creating more detailed planning information per process. So what we've got here is the business process overview on this screen here, which you can see here has quite a lot of information around that. And you can see here an interesting use of color, by the way. If we look back at the little item here, plan approval status, here you can see this is surrounded by yellow. This changes color depending on where you are in the plan approval status. And this is showing that we're currently in progress. If it was approved, that would be green. If it was overdue, that would have turned into a red color. Okay, the next step is the impact assessments. And I'm probably going to move on after we've seen this. So what we've got here is how we are going to record the impact of losing this particular process. So if we lose the revenue collection process, what is the impact on our impact categories? Now, what impact categories you want to record against, each organization has its own views on that. Some organizations only want to use one impact category, others use as many as 6. I mean, I've not known people use more than 8, but you decide what your impact categories are and how many you have. This example is financial, customer impact, legal, brand image, supply chain, and employee impact. You also would decide, if I can move that away, you would also decide here, what timetable do you want to record impact over? You can have as many steps in this as you want, and they can be measured in minutes, hours, and days, any number of those units. And then what you would do is you would go as the user and you would enter the relevant item in here according to this key. Now, of course, you might say, well, what does that key mean? What does minor financial impact look like? If you're a local process owner, you may not have that information. So an important part of the way this solution works is to use this impact rating criteria, which we can see here. This is where you would spell out in great detail how the individual who is performing the impact assessment, this is their key to what the different answers mean. So you therefore know that moderate customer impact is defined by the items here. And you would describe that in as much detail as was appropriate for your organization, because each organization, different terminology and references will make sense. And therefore, that's a very important way of making sure you get good and effective data from the individual that's completing that. You know, I'm not going to go on further down here. This would be too much detail, and I think we're probably a little bit, maybe I'm already pushing time, am I? It's already 2 minutes past 9, heavens. What I just want to show you here on the impact assessment is how all this hangs together. If I just go back there, sorry. A conventional mechanism for doing a process-based business impact assessment is you've got your processes. Your processes depend on in-house services and on external suppliers. In each case, you depend on teams of people, on technology, on buildings, and on data. And the same applies here. And this is your dependency mapping process for a process-based BIA. For a business service-based BIA, and let's imagine you're a bank and you're delivering retail mortgages, what you're doing here is you're saying, well, retail mortgages need 5 of these processes. And unless all 5 of them are working, retail mortgages isn't working. So if I am going to protect my organization's reputation and value and brand and share price, et cetera, and it's about customer experience and customer engagement, which most things in the world are, then you need to make sure you represent that customer journey as part of your business service and then map that against the processes that enable that service. So that's something I wanted to describe. Of course, it gets complicated because different services, so this might be commercial mortgages, this might be insurance business, they all depend on different combinations of underlying processes. And that's something that we've had to spend a lot of time developing. As Marzia said earlier, she's worked with us on two clients. We've worked with her, more to the point, on 2 engagements. And both of those utilize this requirement for business services, particularly the first one. Right, and let's just move over this. This is just demonstrating how we have a business services catalog. We're going back to the system again, and that you can, if you wish, associate processes with that business service catalog. But you know what? That would be too much detail for today's session, I think. And what all this flexibility really is a way of ensuring is that you can match the level of rigor that you want your program to have. So whether you're looking to meet a set of good practice guidelines, such as the Business Continuity Institute publishes their good practice guidelines, very much admired in terms of a basic benchmark, or you're looking to apply an international standard, such as ISO 22301, very popular as a way of ensuring that a certain benchmark being delivered against, or you're looking to apply specific local regulatory requirements. This is, as I've mentioned a few times today, this is the recently published policy statement, which defines operational resilience for the banking sector or the financial services sector in the UK. Each country is coming out with very similar regulatory expectations of different sectors. Whatever level of compliance you're looking to adhere to, The way that we can configure the system is what allows you to apply that. And that is where we come on to the next step, which is the automation and controls. So having got all this in place, you're needing to monitor and make sure that you know where you are in this cycle. This is basically saying, I want this to run smoothly in the background. I, as the business continuity leader, want to be focusing my time on creating cleverer recovery strategies, on creating cleverer protection and risk mitigation strategies, and on presenting the results of those to the powers in the organization to get their buy-in and approval for things that will make this organization more resilient. What I don't want to be doing is chasing people all the time. Have you filled in your BIA? Where's your plan? Why have you only done half of this and then sent it to me, etc., etc. This is what the automation and controller, this is the piece that's looking to take away that deep responsibility, which distracts from the real journey of improving the resilience of the business. This is the compliance piece. Now, there are different things, and we're going to come on to this later, but I think this is worth covering as a very simple example of how that works. So if we have a planning information for each part of our organization being recorded in the system, both the plan completion status, and we looked at how that was delivered by looking at how many of the relevant fields have been completed in the plan, and then we know how complete it is right now. And where is the plan in its approval status? We can then sort by those. So here we can sort straight away and see, right, here we have 4 plans that have not even been started. So the people who own these plans, and by clicking on these, we could quickly identify who the plan owner was and get on the phone to them or email them and say, look, you know, this has been published 2 months ago. I'm seeing you've done nothing. Can you please start work on this? Otherwise, we're not going to have our resilience program in place. You can then see you've got, you know, ones that are half completed here and ones that were 100% completed at the bottom. In fact, you can reorganize that so it sorts a different way. And here you can view it from a different perspective. The other perspective is, where are we in the approval process? Now, at this case, we have 1 approved plan. The remainder are at other stages. The stage beneath is in progress. And we can sort that in different ways. So we can see 1 was rejected, 3 are pending, many are in progress, and so on and so forth. So this is a great way of instantly being able to see, what are people doing with the plans? Are they filling them in? How far through the process are they? And when plans have been completed, where are they in the approval process? Similar information is available on the program controls screen. And here you have that as a way of engaging with really the identical data. So if we want to look at, in this case, these plans that are pending approval, we can list the 3 plans. We can look at some more information behind any one of those that we choose. And if we now want to go and look at the plan, we click the button, and that will take us straight to the actual plan that we are awaiting some further work to be done on. And here we can see that the plan owner is Chad Robbins, and so we know who it is that we should be chasing for this particular piece of work. Okay. The final thing that sometimes can help in this is more detailed analytics around the plan development and around the plan metrics. I'm not going to go into that. That's too much detail for this session. Right, Marzia, I'm about to finish this. The final thing is reports and visualizations. So this is when you've gathered all the information, you are now looking to leverage this. So see software as taking administrative hard work off your back and providing you with the functionality to make decisions, to make recommendations, and to make the organization more resilient. And there's a variety of ways that we do that. The first thing we do, which is nice and straightforward, is we create a beautifully branded and designed plan layout for our individual clients. This is because we work with Word and PowerPoint templates, so we can reflect the absolute detailed branding of each individual client. In this case, you're seeing this fictitious organization, Carlisle Investments. You're seeing the front page, and then the sort of series of pages that you'd expect to see in a plan. And of course, these can be very long, can be very short, depends on what sort of templates our individual clients want. And the same for crisis management plans. You would have the sort of recovery expectations and requirements and who's going to be involved in different roles, etc., etc. So that's a sort of a bedrock of reporting and visualization. The other parts of the reporting piece we're going to look at the relevant stage as Marzia goes through the three elements of the focus of today's session. But the final thing I want to talk about is integrating data sources. This is making sure that you are all pulled together, that all the data is in the right place. For example, you want to make sure that your HR information, that your employee records are absolutely up to date. So therefore, you'll probably synchronize with an HR system such as Workday. You might want to pass information out for further analysis to systems such as Power BI and Tableau. And may answer the question that somebody was asking earlier. So for example, you have Everbridge and OnSolve here and other solutions whereby we would use REST APIs, which is a sort of underlying technical capability, to link the HR data in our system with that system, so that when somebody pushed a button for an emergency notification, then it could be raised from within our system or from within the emergency notification provider. And that integration means that's far easier and far more reliable. Okay, Marzia, I think that is the first session from me concluded, unless anybody that you see that has any questions.
Thanks, Paul. I think you've actually answered the question on emergency notification systems. I think it's probably a good idea just to pause here and see if there's any other questions that anyone wants to raise in person. I mean, obviously, we'll keep an eye on the chat, but seeing as we're in the moment.
Okay, well, shall I stop sharing then and hand over to you?
That's fine, we can pick up. What I will also do is I'm going to stop sharing the results of the last poll because we're about to do another one.
Okay. And Marzia, do you want me to watch the chat window for you?
Would you mind? Thanks, Paul.
Of course, yes.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to share my screen again, so we will be back into the presentation that you're familiar with. Let me know if you're not seeing that. So just something, thank you, Paul. Just something actually that that was intriguing, and I haven't thought about this before, Paul, since it just came to me in terms of this audience. What you've just seen, the demonstration of the software, anybody who's come late into the meeting may have thought that what Continuity Logic was doing was actually, what Paul was doing was showing you how they would run your BC program for you. And it's interesting, and this is why I like Continuity Logic, because anybody here who's currently running a BC or resilience program, if not all of that, then definitely some of that will resonate with you. Some of that process flow will resonate with you. It goes to show you the power of software. None of what Paul demonstrated right now is something that the Continuity Logic team has built in order to sell as management consultants to any client. That's just the power of software. It's infinitely configurable. I say infinitely configurable. Obviously, it's not infinite, but it is largely configurable to whatever you need it to do. And sorry, Paul, I know I'm probably stealing your thunder by saying that. Hopefully, that comes across while we talk through the next few. While we talk through the next few sections. It doesn't matter, again, as we said at the beginning, how complicated or how simple your program is right now in its life cycle. You can mold software to whatever you need right now, and then switch more aspects on as you mature that. And ironically, what you tend to find, and what's interesting about software implementation against any program, is that as teams become aware of how powerful software can be in facilitating resilience and business continuity conversations, so their appetite for more grows exponentially. And you start seeing software that was originally employed for very small requirements growing over time into bigger and bigger and bigger beasts as it takes on more of the load of the team. All right, so let's move on to the next piece. We started off with a poll. I think let's do another one, and this is a slightly different slant on the original of the first poll. So, on the assumption that a lot of you are here with a look or a view to automate, and that came out quite strongly in the first poll, that a lot of the audience today is looking to automate their programs. What are your key drivers? So why are you trying to automate your program? Is it, as Diraj said right at the very beginning in his introduction, that teams are at the moment small and overworked, and the program, by the program I mean the business as usual program of work that is a business continuity or resilience program, is suffering as a result? Is it that you want to expand your program to include new things or new services, but you just don't have the resources to do it? Is it, as Paul mentioned, all those regulatory demands that are coming in across the world? Is it because you are getting increasing demand from regulators or senior stakeholders, and they're asking you questions that you just cannot answer manually? Or is it that you want to manage crises more effectively? So is all of that a crisis management effort? And the poll's now open. Move this off my screen. Again, that will that'll tick along in the background, and we'll have a look at that once we get some feedback in. Right. So, Paul, thank you very much for that introduction to the software. It's always nice to see the software in action. What we're going to do now, as I mentioned, is we're going to go into each one of those individual elements. So we're going to now break apart those elements of workflow, rules and triggers, and reporting and visualization. We'll go into each one of them in detail. Obviously, ask questions. So Paul's monitoring the chat, as he said, interrupt if you want to as well. We do want to turn this into a bit of a conversation if we can. So let us move on to the next slide. Workflow. So remember what I said in the introduction to the agenda. Workflow is the handover of a task from one person to another. So what we're looking at workflow, and the key here is one person handing over to another. So the person, the actual trigger of workflow is always an individual. And sorry, just before I get started, if anyone, Paul and I will introduce a comfort break at some point in the next, during the process of this. To the facilitators on the meeting or anybody else, if you do feel like you want to stop and take a break, please let us know. But back to workflow, right? How do you make sure that people are able to instruct others or to alert others when the next step has arrived or when something needs to be done? Okay, and you can see on the screen it says getting the right people to do the right thing at the right time and making sure that governance can be tracked. A lot of us are still being very strongly managed in terms of audit and in terms of risk functions to maintain compliance to programs, and that takes a lot of time. Examples of workflow. Workflow is a workhorse, right? It's probably, I don't want to disparage it, but it's probably one of the duller sides. It's the workhorse. It's the real back-end engine of a lot of the stuff that we do. It includes approval tasks. So when a plan becomes ready for approval, so when something is handed over for approval, and I need to track that from an audit point of view. It includes risk registers. So a lot of us are being expected at the moment to maintain resilience or business continuity risk registers, sometimes outside of operational risk registers, where the mechanics of logging operational risks are just too great. The materiality of a business continuity or a resilience risk may be too small or too granular in a lot of cases to make it onto an operational risk register, but we're still expected to keep them. We're still expected to create owners for those tasks and make sure that actions are undertaken, and we're being audited against those. Our programs are expected to maintain these. And then post-test issue trackers, also an interesting one. All of us are expected to test our programs. I imagine that if there is any degree of compliance on your program, you're expected to produce robust post-test reports or post-incident reports. And all of those will include action trackers and will include issues registers. Again, we're being audited against these. Again, we're expected to be on top of these. Again, these are often too granular, too small to stick onto an operational risk register, or to gather in a sensible way so that you can create a risk that's large enough to add onto an operational risk register. Right. all of these, the ability to pass those actions onto somebody else or to alert somebody of an action that's pending, I would consider workflow examples. Now, why we brought workflow into this and why workflow is so important from an automation point of view is because, remember, I told you we were going to come back to these icons. Okay. In the event of an incident, in the event of an actual crisis response, right, you need to be able to rely on what you have. So if there's no way for you to rely on the accuracy or the updatedness, if that's a word, of your risk registers or of your recovery planning or of your current crisis or post-crisis response registers, risk registers, it becomes very difficult to rely on any of that information in a crisis. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. You're welcome to put a comment into the chat if you want to, or to voice your opinion. But I imagine that there's more than one person in this audience who has been pushed potentially to the back of a room during a crisis, because in the event of a crisis, no one actually looks at recovery plans or looks at crisis incident playbooks or whatever it is that you've created, because there's no practice of doing that, and there's no reliance or reliability sometimes of that information, right? So in the event of an incident, if you can prove and make your audience comfortable that everything is in governance and it's reviewed properly and it's handed over properly, there's more of a likelihood of somebody's actually going to trust that to be useful in the event of a real crisis. The customer focus is simply allowing more time. I'm looking at the poll results, and quite a lot are coming through as saying the teams are too overworked, right? Giving people time back to do useful things is always valuable. I'm not saying that approvals and workflows and chasing the compliance and chasing the completion of tasks isn't useful, but it's certainly not adding to the overall program and the overall program design and ambition. So being able to allow a machine or being able to automate some parts of the workflow allows you to spend more time doing other things, like, as Paul mentioned, customer journey analysis or evolving your BC program into something slightly more complex. Any questions on workflow? I hope I've explained that. Paul, I'm not sure if there's any questions coming through on the chat.
No.
Okay. So this is a joint presentation. I'll be handing back to Paul in a minute. Should we just go through the polls? How far are we?
I think, well, 23 of 32 have responded.
Okay. Let's give it a bit more time. I am intrigued to see that the lead poll there is the ability to manage crises more efficiently. And I'd be interested if anybody would like to voice their opinion on that or tell us why that should be. I'd be interested to understand that myself. It is the be all and end all of a resilience and BC program, being able to put it into practice. Okay, so in terms of the presentation, let's just give some people the time to finish that poll. Right. Paul, do you want to take us through what you have from a workflow specific point of view? And the reason why, what we'll do now is Paul will show you what workflow actually means. It's useless me just talking about it in theory. Let's actually look at a few examples of how workflow manifests in software. And then we'll take that away and actually look at the lessons learned in actually trying to do this in the past. Paul, are you happy to take that? Paul, I think you may be on mute.
I shouldn't be on mute, but
there you are.
Yeah?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay. Good. I'm wondering whether I'm on the right microphone. Actually, I've just been sillily switching my microphones around.
Right, you've gone again, Paul. We could hear you when you were talking about microphones.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
There you are. You're back
okay.
again.
Yeah, great, okay. I've messed around a little bit here and spoiled some things, but that doesn't matter. Let's just, as long as you can hear me at all, we're good. So let me now share my screen. Share screen. This will stop the others' screen sharing. Do you know? Yes, I do know. Right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by going back to something that we saw in the earlier session, and this was this email. But I'm going to break this email down because workflow, I think, is beautifully represented. All the different elements of a workflow are beautifully represented within a single reminder email. So let's just focus on what we're trying to do here. And to go back to the key element of what workflow is about, it's making sure the right things happen and are completed by the right people in the right sequence and receive the right approval. That is the primary purpose of a workflow. Now, whether the things that are being conducted by the system or whether they are being conducted by an individual who's typing information in doesn't really matter. Let's assume that both of those are equally applicable. But here they are manifested in an email. And if we just go through the different steps here, first of all, workflows are automatic. I put at the bottom here, this is an automatically generated email. So the system handles the workflow for you. We'll look in a little bit about how you generate a workflow. But the system generates workflows automatically and the different steps are followed automatically. Secondly, the date is often a trigger, but not always. So in this case, the workflow has been triggered because the date, Tuesday, the 9th of February 2021, came around. And that was what indicated that we must let James Chilton know he now needs to do his plan. He needs to update the finance department's business continuity plan. But triggers can be other things. We will look later, Match is going to talk about rules and triggers, and therefore I'm going to sort of show some examples of that in software. But it might be triggered by something else, not a date. It could be triggered by a risk threshold having been exceeded. It could be triggered by the fact that when a synchronization with IT applications reveals that an application is no longer has a quick enough recovery time capability to meet the needs of the processes that use that software application, then that may automatically prompt, okay, we've got a misalignment here, this application is not recovering fast enough, we need to do some work to understand how to fix that. So workflows are triggered often by dates, but not always. Many times by other components and changes in the underlying data. And this is all part of Match's section on getting the work done without having to employ an army. In effect, you're using the system to watch over your data and notify you when things need to be updated. The other part of the workflow is it goes to somebody. This is assigning the workflow to a person, almost always. The next thing is you're telling them what they have to do. You're telling them where to go to do it. And you're making sure that this is part of a sign-off and approval process. So you don't just ask someone to do it and then say, okay, it's done now. You can do that, but more often than not, you'll want somebody else to validate that the right piece of work has been done. This is all part of the validation process. So I think that email, that single simple email, sort of contains, highlighted, and I'm hoping the yellow highlighting is clear, highlights the different elements of a workflow process. And we've already looked at this report. We looked at this a little bit earlier, but I think it's important, having said what I've just said now, to repeat this, that having done that work, you can then see how complete is my plan in this case, and how approved is my plan. And the same would apply whether it was updating a call group, updating a software application's recovery time capability, learning lessons from a test and exercise. You would certainly have a workflow around a test whereby the test is triggered, the test is held on a certain date, the lessons are learned from it, and then you're wanting someone to feed back their suggestions for improvement to those lessons. That again would be a workflow.
So you would have maybe something similar to the screen you're seeing here to remind you of those different types of workflow processes. And we saw earlier also the program controls where you can drill in. And I'm not going to do that again because we've been through that. So that's an important part of monitoring this is your eyes, really, your eyes and ears come through the dashboard, through the Enterprise Resilience Center, so you can make sure you know what's going on across your resilience domain and that you know when to intervene and when you can just let things go. Now, there's another side to this, and that is that sometimes workflows aren't just simple, do this, when you've done it, let me know, somebody else approves it, somebody else signs it off. Sometimes you want to assemble workflows into more sophisticated projects. And I'm just going to glimpse here at the assembling of a project. So here you can see we're in a series of admin tools. This would only be available to a senior user in the business. You can see here, this is our business continuity leader, Sarah Maddox, who's logged in here. And she has access to some other items. And one of these is project design. And here she has created a number of projects which may span periods of time and cover different types of topic, DR tests, a COVID HR assessment, which is actually the example I'm going to look at here, survey for a product, monthly product surveys, etc., etc. Here's her list of projects, and this is looking at the first 10 of 53 projects that she's created here. She can also review these projects on a timeline. So this can be very helpful. If you're the business continuity leader and you want to be able to look at a calendar and say, okay, what's currently in play? What's coming up? And here we can see that from the 24th of March, we had a new project starting to update the media response procedures, maintain PR agency details, etc., etc. You can see on a nice chart, not only in a list of projects that have been assigned or workflows, you can also look at these on a calendar to understand the cycle of work over the course of the year. And let's go back to the list. Now, as I said, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to show creating a new project, just so you can see some of the possibilities here. You would decide what is the name for this project. In this case, it's a sophisticated BIA sequence we're going to conduct for financial year 21-22. We select to have a start date and an end date for that project, 9th May through to 8th August. And we say, which form are we going to use as the heart of this project to gather our information? We're going to use our business impact analysis form. And workflow settings are set here. Now, this is where you can see the range of options that is available in a workflow. And I think some of the key points here are really on this right-hand side, whereby you can decide, are we going to have every element of the workflow conducted in sequence, which means that one thing happens, then the next thing happens, then the next thing happens, or are we at certain points going to allow parallel sequencing? So one person does something, and then that is immediately notified to two people who need to do their own stream of work, which can happen in parallel, and then it may come together at the end for a final sign-off. So this is where you would set up those controls that you want to have in place and give the workflow a name within your overall project. And then you would decide what individuals do you want to be involved in the different stages of that project as the respondents. And that's again where you'd enter that. Okay, so let's go back to our project list and now look at one that's already been conducted. And this is this COVID-19 HR assessment. This in actual fact is a self-contained project. It contains all the information, and as much as what we're doing is we are creating a way of sending out a questionnaire to individuals about their current status vis-a-vis COVID-19. And from that, we're going to, because we're creating a back to work program, we want to gather information from these people and understand what happens next and what was the most appropriate next step for us to undertake. So here we have the general project settings. It's a COVID assessment. It's a survey to understand likely exposure to COVID and the resultant plans to protect staff. We have start and end dates for this project. And the associated form is the COVID-19 employee safety tracker form that we have created. And we're going to ask a number of people to participate in this survey, and they're going to be asked a sequence of questions. Here are the project workflow settings that we've set up for that. We looked at these a little bit earlier. And if we go back now and look at the results at the end of this, we see here the total number of employees that were asked the questions, the number at risk within a certain region, in this case within EMEA, and then we can see the answers that came back from individuals if you want. So we can either consolidate all the responses into an aggregated data set, or we can drill in and look at individual people within our data set to see what their risk status is and the background to that. And if I just drill into one of those, in this case, Robert Jones, you can see here, these were the questions that we were asking this individual. First of all, is he prepared to participate? Asking about testing, symptoms, etc., 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 the sort of things that you can imagine. And of course, this can be used for any type of questionnaire you want to publish out. And then we have our risk assessment. And our risk assessment for this particular individual is that as per guidelines, this indicates high risk of exposure to COVID-19. So please do not come to work. Please keep updated on your condition. For more information on how to take care of yourself, please see these guidelines. So there is an example, and I don't want us to get too hung up at all about the COVID-19 thing. That's just a sort of a topical, I suppose, example of the use of workflows and assembling workflows into projects. But all of this is a way of taking the burden of sending information out, chasing it up, asking people if they're completing it, and then bringing the information back and analyzing it. It's a way of taking that burden off the business continuity and operational resilience teams and being able to say, you focus your time strategically on designing how to make this organization more resilient. Let the workflow make sure everything that you want to happen does happen, so you're only intervening when something has gone wrong. So that's my piece on that, Marzia.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for that. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. Let me get that up again, the slideshow. All right, I'm going to move the polls aside. Right, thank you. So before we carry on, are there any questions for Paul immediately? Again, we're watching the chats. Let me know, Paul, if you can't see my screen.
I'm seeing it.
Okay. All right, so thanks for that. I mean, look, let's move on in the presentation. So actually, before we start reading the screen,
sorry.
What Paul's just, yes,
sorry,
please.
Sorry, I have a question, if you don't mind, directly to Paul. With all the options that you explained, is the system is entirely customizable? Like, for example, you showed us the severity assessment table, the SAT table 0, 1, 2, 3. Will that be customizable? We can add our own table for to avoid any personal judge or?
Yes, it is entirely, and it's a feature of the system that's normally I would demonstrate, but decided not to do today because it is a 10-minute session in its own right. So the simple answer is yes, it's completely customizable. Probably the equally important answer to your question is that also it can be done by the user organization. It doesn't need us to do it. So it's not that we're changing the software or changing the code in the product. That obviously is a very costly and time-consuming job and has all sorts of problems associated with it. It's what we call a zero-code software platform that we have created. And that means that we typically, during the implementation process with the clients, we consult with them as we're going through that process and find out from them what is going to be most in their interest. And so the product that's delivered to them is configured with specifically what they want. Then going down the line, and Marzia has experience of this herself with her own clients that she's worked with, her own organizations that she's been employed by, is that sometimes a big change is required. And rather than doing it themselves as a client, our clients will come to us and say, look, we've got a piece of work here. We need you to do this. We need it delivering within the next few weeks. And this is what we want. And we'll engage on that basis and do the work. Other times, and increasingly with some of our clients, this is becoming the norm, they will do the work in-house themselves and reconfigure the system and customize it around what they want to achieve. So that's the short and the long answer to your question, I hope.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks. That's
My pleasure.
fair enough. Yeah.
My pleasure. Back to you, Marzia.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm just looking at the poll, and it's interesting. I'm not sure why the numbers are 8 out of 26. So we seem to have some people voting multiple times. So obviously, there's a number of drivers.
No, I can tell you, Marzia, it's because this is a multi-choice question.
Ah, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what
so
it is.
Your team can be too small and overworked, and you can want to manage crises more effectively. Yes. Okay,
good. So just moving on the presentation then. Let's go to that second slide. So just we've reached the point now where we're just hopefully going to open up into some discussion. Some of the lessons learned with workflow. And again, as I said, this is possibly the driest piece of automation. Interestingly, and as we're seeing in the poll, a third of the responses are to do with let me just move that poll out the way. A third of the responses are to do with teams being too small or overworked to actually manage this type of thing. One of the biggest drivers always to automate a program is simply that, teams not having the time to do things properly, often resulting in poor audits or program leaders being slapped on the wrist because things aren't in appropriate governance. And as policies and standards become more and more complicated and demanding, so that just increases that demand on people. So it's interesting that the two are tying up to some degree. What I would say, just seeing again Paul's demonstration, I have actually seen some conversations or some programs where this is the only driver. The simple need to reduce the amount of time that teams are spending on Excel spreadsheets or chasing individuals or making sure that people are signing things off in time so that audit doesn't come knocking. That in and of itself is often the only driver to automate software or to automate programs. I'll just caveat that slightly. Chances are, to some degree, you may not be employing enterprise software or SaaS solutions in the, as Paul's been demonstrating, but chances are you've been forced to automate in some degree, to some degree, whether that's a smart spreadsheet or something that you're using to help you to mechanize or to track or to report on your current status, right? You're probably automating a little bit, and automating on an Excel spreadsheet is still automating. You're still helping yourself. The question is, when do you actually move ahead? So again, it's not often that I've come across a program that has the funding or the appetite to automate a program only to look at workflow. But certainly, almost every single deployment that I've come across, automating a workflow is the first thing those programs get right. So they understand that it's the key, one of the easiest, I want to say cheapest ways of very quickly injecting time into teams. And an example of this is actually somebody that one of the organizations I used to work with, Pre-Automation, where a post-incident or a post-crisis test report used to take 90 days. They used to allow themselves 90 days to develop a post-test report. And that involved not just documenting the observations from the test report, but also gathering scripts and gathering answers and gathering feedback from all of the participants, creating issues and actions registers, chasing people to complete actions and issues. Okay, they effectively employed 4 people full-time to manage their crisis testing team to do this, and they weren't managing to get through all of the regulatory requirement for testing. Okay, that in and of itself, once that was automated, dropped the amount of effort dramatically, because the machine started doing all the chasing for them, allowing them to do more testing. Okay, so they invested in software for other reasons, but the first advantage or the first value that they really saw coming out of the software was workflow. or work or reduction in team effort because of workflow. Okay, so just to go back to the slides, decreasing labor and decreasing effort in order to allow people to do more things has always been a key driver for automation. But just a few notes, okay? And unfortunately, this is an argument that you tend to have across all programs. Just because you're relying on the machine, okay, doesn't mean that the machine will do the thinking for you. So you still have to have a fair idea of what it is that you want, and you still are going to have to build out those rules and configuration. The previous question was actually a very, very good one. The degree to which software can be customized to your exacting requirements is actually quite a key selling point. And often we miss this when we look at RFPs or we look at software demonstrations. A vendor will come to you with a demonstration beautifully presented, and it will, of course, it'll work. You know, it will present a standard BC program. Not many vendors, I think, would go into the level of detail that Paul's gone, where you actually go into the back end working and the customization is made visible to you. If you can't customize software, trust me, you are going to land up with a very expensive toy, and you're going to be back on an Excel spreadsheet within a couple of months. So you still need to build rules and configuration. Your software still needs to be able to do that, do that with you, but you are going to have to spend the time making sure you really understand, or you can really document that end-to-end approval process. What is it you want people to do? Who are those people? And what are those triggers? When do you want them to be engaged? What do you do about people who go on long-term leave and they've got actions? Do you need that dual hat, that parallel process of approval, as Paul demonstrated, just to make sure you don't have any single points of failure? Is there the ability to reverse workflow? Can you actually back out of something? All of those questions you'll have to sit down and think through, and often your software vendor will work through those if you ask the right questions to begin with. Right, you're still going to have to do quality checks. Risk and audit teams like software. They're starting to demand, in some cases, that things are managed through software, but they're still going to dig into the detail. So some risk and audit teams are still going to want to interrogate or test the individual compliance elements of approvals and task completions. You're still going to need to present evidence that tasks have been appropriately completed. So in some cases, you can build the software up to do a lot of that evidence gathering for you so that it's easily accessible. You're not having to have shared drives or shared folders or evidence gathering mechanisms outside of software. You can use the software to do that for you, but you are still going to have to set time aside to make sure that the software is doing what you need it to do, and that it's doing it properly. So check the software, build that time in to actually do that first line risk management or that first line checking. And then the final point is, it doesn't matter how you automate things, unfortunately, and I've seen this done too many times, and I've seen this coming back to bite teams too many times. You still cannot trust people that they're going to read things. So you can, as Paul showed you, you can create a beautiful, complicated plan, really, really mature planning with all the resources attached to it, and you can design something that really, in a crisis, and this is the point, right? This is what the majority of you said in the poll. This is why you want to automate, being able to manage crises at the end of the day. You can do all of this hard work. You can put all the compliance and checks and balances in to make sure that people are approving things within the right time. You cannot guarantee that people are still going to read things. So again, talk to software vendors. If you are going to do this with software vendors, talk to them ahead of time and make sure that it's not just possible, but that you can build it into your implementation design requirements. Force, this sounds terrible, but force ownership and understanding. Okay? Make sure there is a way to if not guarantee that somebody's read something, that certainly that person is encouraged to attest to the fact that they have read something. You don't want to ever get into the point where you're trying to use a plan in a crisis and the owner of the plan turns around and says, oh, well, I just signed that off. You know, you kept nagging me to sign it off. I signed it off. I didn't actually read the thing. So force those conversations in. It is very, very hard to retrospectively build that type of workflow into a program that has already been deployed. That's not to say it's impossible, but once somebody's used to using software in a certain way, to get them to change that habit actually means not just a change of software, but it means re-education and training. And sometimes it's a difficult conversation to have. You can introduce it right at the beginning, understanding the nature of resilience and recovery plan sign-offs. It's just that much easier. And then building segregation of duty. This is something that actually audit teams and risk teams seem to be coming, that it's quite an old-fashioned thing. It seems to have been really, really important 10, 15 years ago to employ real segregation of duty, making sure that you're not marking your own homework, making sure that the person authoring a plan, putting the detail, is not the same person that is signing the plan off. It seemed to be really, really strong. It then, for some reason, seemed to die. So at some point in the last, certainly in the last couple of deployments, and it's potentially just because teams are too busy and too thin on the ground to deal with this. So they'll absorb the risk of a segregation of duty mishap rather than taking time out from more people to do this. But I've seen it creeping back in again. There is a need and a demand from audit and risk teams, as well as the actual resilience teams, to make sure that people who are maintaining and authoring plans are not the same as the people who are signing them off. And in some cases, they take it a step further, where they are demanding that the person approving the plan has no ability to adjust the content of the plan. Now, that's potentially too far for some of you, especially where teams are small and owners tend to be the authors of their own planning. It's just something to keep in mind. So those are the lessons learned with workflow. We'll get into more interesting lessons, I think, when we come to triggers and we come to reporting. Are there any questions from the audience? Right, I mean, I hope you're finding this useful. Right, we've got, what I'm going to suggest, Paul, that we do now, we've got an hour left on the clock, just over. Shall we take a brief comfort break? I realize we've been at it for just about 2 hours. Should we take a brief comfort break? Everybody stand up and maybe walk around just to bring blood back to your heads. And then we'll regroup, shall we say, on the hour. Well, it may be on the half hour, depending on where you are in the time zones. That gives you roughly 5 minutes to have a walk around and come back again.
Great. See you in a bit.
Right. Thanks all. If you want to take a break, we'll see you in 5 minutes. Right, hopefully we've got everybody back at their desks. Paul,
I'm
can
here.
you hear me?
I'm here, Marzia. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Right, so let's
I've got a coffee.
Okay.
I'm not saying stop for me, but just to let you know if you're clinking of me, stirring the sugar.
So let's get started again. There was a question, Paul. We didn't talk about it during your demonstration. Maybe we can cover it off at some point about mobile applications and mobile app versus browser accessibility. So if you get a chance, maybe to talk through that. And
Well,
I know that.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I can just talk to that now if that helps. So
yes,
the mobile apps are primarily aimed, the Android and the iOS apps have the primary function of synchronizing the latest versions of plans that the owner of the mobile device is involved in onto that device once a day typically. So that means that the person who is carrying the mobile phone through the dedicated app will always have copies of the plans in which they are involved at the latest data publication on their mobile phone. That's the app. The browser driven component of this is all the other functionality. So triggers, completing information, understanding through visualizations and reporting what's going on. That is all done through the browser on the mobile device, because each individual organization's configuration is different to accommodate the different requirements that we've been discussing. And so rather than having a fixed mobile app, we make sure that everybody can use their own specific configuration through the browser on their mobile device.
thanks, Paul. Actually, it's an interesting point. It's not something I was looking to, or I had listed to chat about today, but it's worth mentioning. Again, it's to do with that initial setup and what questions you ask if you ever go into RFP or if you ever start speaking to vendors, and that's the availability of data off network. So a lot of these software providers allow multiple ways to access the system. Some organizations demand single sign-on. That's because, ironically, not ironically really, but the nature of resilience and business continuity programs is that we deal in private data. We don't just deal in where critical software lies in terms of actual data centers, and we don't deal with the criticality or risks and gaps in data center capabilities. But we also, in some cases, for emergency notification purposes, bring in personal and private people information and data, right? So there's all sorts of GDPR complications that go with specifically BC and resilience deployments. Some organizations insist on single sign-on. Some they insist on specific security requirements and protocols to being employed. Now, back to the poll, right? You're talking about needing to be able to use the software and manage crises more effectively. We saw a couple of weeks ago, I don't know how many people it impacted, but there were a number of organizations that were complaining about Citrix instability, where people who are forced to work from home because of COVID were suddenly finding the Citrix environments overwhelmed, and they couldn't get access into the applications. Now, that means if you've got browser-based resilience or continuity or crisis management software that's embedded in your organization, and you need to be able to be within your organization's network in order to access that, actually, in the event of a crisis or in the event of a Citrix or a single sign-on outage, that makes your software inaccessible. So it's something to think about. This may or may not apply to you. And again, it wasn't something I was actually planning to speak about today, but it's becoming increasingly a topic of conversation, especially in the deployments that I've been busy with. If you need to be able to access plans or crisis management information off network, just be sure that you're able to do that, that you have a way of doing that, and that you have a way of doing that securely, especially when you're referencing sensitive information. So that's just an aside, and it seemed like a good opportunity to mention that. Okay, let's move on in the presentation. Let's start talking about rules and triggers. Now, this is starting to get more this now starts to get more complicated. Paul's already touched on some of the ways that you can use rules and triggers, right? The difference, let's just go into the next slide. Okay, these are event or date-driven actions, right? Events and date-driven could mean anything. The difference between a workflow in my language and a trigger is simply that a workflow is something that an individual passes over to another individual. Whereas a warning and a rule and a trigger in this case, or warnings, has to do with the machine doing it for you. So it's the machine or some event being watched for that then triggers off some other action. Now that could be triggering a workflow, as Paul's just mentioned. It could be triggering an action for somebody to manage, or it could be triggering something else, a report. So examples of these, and I'm hoping that Paul is able to show you this, because the first one is actually one of the ones that features most commonly in most programs, especially when you start talking about readily understandable concepts within traditional BC and resilience programs, right? That's recovery time, objective, demand, and capability. So what if you were able to let the machine track the current state of your demand on technology, so business demand on technology through recovery time objective mapping, and the capability or the capacity of the application to meet that demand. So often what happens especially in large organizations, IT resilience or IT continuity and disaster recovery teams are separate to the business continuity and resilience teams. So what happens in IT, somebody has to actually ask for that information or wait to be told whether there's a change in testing outcome or capability outcome. Now, if you can bring that into the software, and again, that does depend on integration of software and data, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that. Imagine the advantages of somebody getting an alert when something's no longer resilient enough. And I put resilient enough in inverted commas because that's a completely, understanding what resilient enough means is we can go into it if anybody's got any questions. But again, we can talk for a very long time on how you determine what resilient enough means. Anniversary control. Again, this is one of those things that typically wastes a huge amount of time in team. That's people chasing owners and maintainers to start reviews. If you're looking at an annual review cycle of recovery plans or crisis plans or playbooks, right, and you want to give people 3 months advance warning of that work needing to be done, and then you need to track that work to completion so that nobody goes out of compliance at anniversary, it's a huge amount of nagging and busy work. Again, you can use software to help you, and that's watching dates. That's allowing the machine to watch a calendar and then push a response out or push a notification out on your behalf, that you don't have to keep monitoring every morning who's in, who's out of compliance, or who will be or out of compliance in the next 3 months, 2 months. Policy, standard, and procedures. A lot of you will have robust policies, standards, procedures documented and managed, key controls, key risk registers, etc. Again, some organizations demand that these be managed and reported from a controls register point of view and evidenced on a regular basis. The doing of that can be incredibly time consuming. Again, there's a lot of business continuity controls that you can build into software. Again, if you start thinking about building your controls and risks environments into your software when you're starting to implement, there's actually not very much that I've seen that you cannot automate with software. And what that means is that when it comes around to producing those key control reports or key risk indicators, it's simply that at the click of a button, or it's available online as you need it. Okay. So being able to flag slippage in controls and policies is important. You can use triggers and workflow to actually alert you when controls slip, provided there's a measurement that can be defined. But you can also use it very, very well to then use it as a report or a dashboard. And we can get into dashboards at a later point as well. And then the final one, and again, we can talk about this for ages, it's becoming more and more a topic of conversation, the design and test of crisis playbooks. COVID has resulted in the design of a huge number of pandemic playbooks, for example, and the mentality of playbooks seems to be growing. In addition to, so not as a replacement of crisis plans or business recovery plans, but in addition to crisis and recovery plans. So again, if you're able to design and test playbooks, and I've actually seen this demonstrated, and it's almost too difficult to demonstrate in a sitting like this because of the number of aspects that come into it. But just sit back and picture, for example, the power of being able to create a playbook, a COVID playbook. Actually, let's not take a COVID playbook. Let's take a technology playbook. Being able to design a technology loss playbook, which then pulls into itself all the underlying or dependent recovery plan tasks, technology instructions, crisis management tasks, all those elements that make up the various plans that lie across your organization, pulling that data in towards itself in order for you to have a triggered playbook. And a trigger in this event is actually an event occurring, the loss of something, the drop of of server performance to a certain point. You know, it's up to you to define what it is, depending on your own organization. But again, that's a type of thing that you could eventually employ software to do for you, is to intelligently manage playbooks for you. And imagine if you can then extend that into testing. So it's a fascinating thing, rules and triggers. In actual fact, the majority of the software will base itself in rules. You know, the software doing things based on the design and the processes already employed within your program. So I'll stop talking for a minute. I want to give Paul a chance to do a demonstration again of rules and triggers, and then we'll come back into some of the key things to watch out for. Paul, if you're ready. Again, I'll be watching the chat while Paul's speaking if there's any questions you'd like to ask.
Great, thank you, Marzia. Yes, I am ready. I just thought I'd share my camera for a few seconds before I start this. Are you hearing me clearly again?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so let me share my screen. So as you said, Marzia, I'm going to show an example of the first of your RTO delivery examples there as to how this can operate. So I'm hoping that you're seeing my screen now. Are you?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I was just battling to find the mute button. Yes,
okay.
We can.
So I'm starting with this. This is not a rule or a trigger. This is a report. Now, it is, though, a helpful report. And let me just explain what it's telling you. Let me just turn my camera off. I don't think it adds anything, does it? So what this is telling the person viewing the report is, on the left-hand side, you can see a list of all the software applications in the business. Of course, there could be hundreds or even thousands. So there could be many, many pages or a long, long screen listing all the different software applications in the organization. And it tells you in this particular report where it's being provided from. And then in the next column, the RTC column, the recovery time capability column, it's highlighting how rapidly can this application be recovered and has that been tested. And so where it is marked with an amber unset, it means there is no real understanding of the recovery time capability or a test hasn't been applied. But the rest of them you can see, first one is a 4-hour recovery time capability, then 1 day, and so on and so forth. The next column in, the ERTO, is the earliest recovery time objective of any of the services or processes that use that application. So if we look at the first one, Exchange Server, it's provided from IT in London. It can be recovered in 4 hours following an incident, and all the people who use it are quite happy with 4 hours. They are saying their earliest recovery time objective of any of the processes is also 4 hours. And the same, by the way, for recovery point objectives, which is the next point, but I'm just going to talk about the RTC and ERTO here. The one that's fifth down, the Workday, you can see, provided by IT London, that has an 8-hour recovery time capability. But there are multiple services that need Workday to be recovered within 4 hours if they are going to meet their recovery time objective, i.e. they can't perform their work without Workday being available within 4 hours of an incident being declared, but Workday can only recover in this example within 8 hours. So there's a gap, which is why that's highlighting in red. So that's a normal report. It's pretty valuable. And in fact, the RTO impact profile and RPO impact profile on the right are equally valuable. I won't go into that. That would be too long to explain. But this is a powerful report. But you've got to look all the way down it, what may be dozens of pages, and print it out or look at it on the screen, take the time to review it to highlight the fact there's a problem. So the next step up is not a report, but it's a report which now has a rule applied to it. And that rule is saying here, I only want a report which highlights those items where there is a gap. And I want this once a week to be emailed to this distribution list. Now that's a step up, isn't it? That's getting more powerful now. So what we're saying is every Friday at midday, let's say, or whatever day of the week you choose, you are going to get a list of non-compliant IT applications. And this may go to the IT risk manager, saying, look, you're not delivering what the business needs here in terms of recovery capability. I suggest you have a chat, and that appears every week for someone to look at. But the real power and a rule with a trigger is this. And what this is saying is that as soon as there is a synchronization between the ServiceNow, let's say, list of software applications and the continuity logic system, or as soon as somebody enters a new recovery time capability into the record for a software application, then a rule would automatically trigger a response. And this response, you can see, is a very simple text message. It could be all sorts of manifestations of this. It could be an email, it could be a text message, it could be a workflow, it could be a notification through the continuity logic software. So a ping would sound, and that would then trigger someone to look at their mobile device. But here it's keeping it nice and simple. It's a text message. And what this text message is saying, it's come from the CL360, which is the name of our software template. It's saying, dear CISO, please note that as of this time on this date, the recovery time capability of these software applications, Settlements Express and its reference number there, and Wire Transfer and its software application reference number there, moved out of compliance with the recovery time objectives of the business processes that these applications support. This could lead to process recovery failure and should be addressed ASAP. For full details, visit your CL360 dashboard, which you could do on the mobile device, of course, or you could log on and do that on a full computer. Now, that arrives the second the problem happens, because you can see this has arrived today at 17:57, and the trigger occurred at 17:57. That is the moment at which the recovery time capability of these listed software applications moved out of requirement of the processes that are using those software applications. Hence, that was sent out immediately. Now, that for me is a simple but powerful example of getting the software to watch over your data and using rules and triggers to make sure you are notified the moment something relevant happens across your whole resilience program, which you should be attending to. So that's that from me, Marzia, unless there are any questions that have come up in that time.
Thanks, Paul. Let me just share my screen while we wait in case anybody does have any questions. Right, you should be seeing my screen again. So let's just you raise an interesting point, and that's always a fascinating example, Paul, of triggers and rules, and the way that you can actually use software to think for you or to do some of the heavy lifting for you. You can apply that to anything, to a lot of questions and a lot of situations. But I just want to take a pause there before we get into the nitty-gritty of rules and triggers. you can see that this is a step up, right? This is beyond just managing data. So the actual maintenance or data capture of recovery plans, or the compliance information that would lead into a workflow or an approval request that we spoke about in the first section on workflow, right? All of that can stand alone. You could absolutely have all of your plans automated, the data capture of plans, to make sure that you could store that, retain that, and report on that efficiently without ever employing a rule or a trigger. Okay, the rules and the triggers are actually really leveraging the wealth of data that you're creating business recovery plans and bringing data into systems in order to create recovery plans end to end. That data is so rich, and what you can do with it is almost endless, that's where rules and triggers really come into their own. So if you want to look at this as an evolution, you could start with the workflows and the core business impact assessment and data capture recovery planning, with the idea of moving towards better employment of rules and triggers at a later date. Okay, what I want to do, again, just in the same pattern though, is start looking at some of the things that we've learned through deployments. And again, Paul and I have done this enough times across different organizations that these things keep coming up. So the first one is, this is actually incredibly meaty. You, as the individuals asking the vendors or asking for any part of your program to be defined, you've got to know and you've got to define what good looks like. And that sounds simple, but often enough, I've sat in situations where you're trying to understand how to employ certain rules or certain triggers or applying intelligence to a program. And the question is asked of the software vendor, well, how do we do this? Now, often a software vendor is going to be able to answer you in principle. In many instances, they will offer a management consultancy element to you for a fee, probably, but they will offer that to you to help you to design your program. But even though what Paul's showing you, CL360, is effectively resilience and BC in a box, okay, unless you are willing to take what's on the shelf and use it absolutely 100% without applying any customization or any thought to really molding it to your organization's program, don't expect the software vendor to define what good looks like for you. Okay, take the time to do this. That includes your attitude to risk and risk appetite, what your specific controls and indicators are. So how do you actually measure what good looks like? How do you tell if something is resilient? Now, how do you measure that? What are the elements that you need to build into your program to allow you to do more than just have raw data at your fingertips? It takes time, okay, and it takes an attitude of change. So one of the things that I think is one of the biggest mistakes that I think we make with software employment is the traditional waterfall way of doing software implementations, where you build incredibly large and complicated requirements right up front. It takes so long to employ it, but by the time you've delivered it, it's already out of date and already parts of it are no longer relevant. And there's no real capacity to go back and retrospectively change things. So spend some time upfront working out how you want to do things. And I've actually just jumped ahead a couple of steps. I'll get back to that. Spend your time, the second bullet, spend your time understanding what keeps you up at night. Okay, what keeps you up at night? The RTO compliance gap is a very good example of things that keep us up at night. And things that, if they go wrong, are going to land up becoming a problem later from a reporting or from a compliance point of view. So it's a very easy way of looking at what rules and triggers you want to employ, even as a starting point in your software. Look at what keeps you up at night. Look at what keeps your stakeholders up at night from a resilience and BC point of view. Translate those into rules and conditions. If you can, especially if you're looking at a particularly large deployment or a particularly complex program, that you need to look to automate. Invest in a business analyst. Now, this doesn't necessarily need to be a consultant that comes in. It could just be somebody on your team who does it as part of their day job. So bring it away from side of desk and actually allow people the time to analyze what it is that you need. The organizations I've worked with in the past have had the luxury of having dedicated teams looking at software deployment for resilience and BC programs. That's not to say you have to have that type of a program design, but if you can, invest in that type of a skill. Don't compromise on data quality. So Paul's already spent some time talking about the ways that you can integrate with various data sources. I'm a big fan of employing golden source data. Some of the organizations that we're working with, that may be yours as well, are placing increasing focus on data controls officers and data controls policies and standards. Okay, so we know that we've lived with spreadsheet data for a while. Some of us can continue to work on spreadsheet data for a while yet. But if you're going to bring source data into the application, do it in a considered fashion. Okay, do not accept bad data into your system. Rather, don't automate something, or rather postpone automation of something until you can improve the quality of the data, than bringing bad data into the application and then trying to wriggle your way around that. Okay, again, this is one of those things. If you cannot convince users of your software or users of a software-based application that they can rely on the data immediately, they are going to immediately stop using it, and then you'll find that that function or that software is just either not relied on, or that function is switched off, or you land up back on a spreadsheet months after you've deployed your automation, and all those good intentions go out the window. And then the final bit, and that's to do with small steps. Now, agile there, I know agile is an overused term at the moment, and you could write it with a small a just as easily. It doesn't matter if you're doing, agile mature, if you're employing agile mature processes, or you've got Scrum boards and you've got, agile software running in your teams. It's the principle that applies here. And the most successful software deployments I've seen are the ones that start small. So there's an aspiration to employ software. The return on investment may be slight to begin with, because laying the groundwork at the beginning results in very little automation that's visible to senior stakeholders in the first instance, and then slowly evolving that. So learning, failing fast, learning from what it is that you've done and how you want to improve that, and then building a data curious attitude into your own teams and into your stakeholders, and proving that automation over time, it achieves two things, right? It makes sure that people use your software, or use the software that you've paid for, rather than throwing their hands up in the air and saying, this is no use, I can't do anything with this. But it also allows you to keep the software current. Okay? One of the biggest disappointments, I would say, is hearing about software deployments that they're bought for 2-3 years on contracts. By the time the 2 or 3 years come up, everyone's fallen out of love with the software. It's not doing what they want anymore. The vendor's not engaged anymore in any conversation or any roadmap with you as an organization. And what do? You go out to RFP. It's not the software's problem. The software may be absolutely able to keep up with your program if you allow it to. But if you stop talking to vendors and you stop having change conversations, resilience programs move too quickly to allow you to stagnate from a software point of view. You're going to land up in an everlasting cycle of RFP. You're going to spend a year going through RFP, procurement, redeployment, re-implementation, retraining. You're then going to have 2 years of contracts, and you're going to go back into the same cycle, because by the time 2 years have passed, you're going to be out of line with your program. That was a lot of talking. So I'll stop there and ask if there's any questions.
Well, there's a great question come in while you've been doing that, Marzia, and thanks for that. So Kapil has asked, and you could write a book on this, I think, but let's try to say a few paragraphs on it. How can an existing operational risk framework and automation be leveraged in BCM automation? Do you need some clarification?
I would like some clarification on that, or a bit more example behind that.
So Kapil, could you come on microphone and give us a little bit more context?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Yes, perfectly.
Right. So the first premise, okay, that we're starting, and which is in the context of this question, is that BCM is the fat tail part of operational risk.
Yes.
And therefore a natural subset of operational risk. Second, in operational risk, we are already defining a number of processes, risk controls, indicators. The point is, do we do this altogether differently from a BCM context, or is this something that we leverage on a framework that has been designed for operational risk? Second is from the data, okay, that is present in an operational risk system, and thirdly from people and the way the organization is organized.
Do you mind
I hope
if
that was clarification now.
That is a big question. Yes, go for it, Paul.
I'm so excited by that question. So, and this is a sort of okay, I apologize. I'm moving into a little bit of a sales mode. So, Continuity Logic is an operational risk provider. We are an ERM, enterprise risk management, whatever terminology you want to use. We see business continuity as the place, and operational risk as a place where much of the data is gathered for this, but everything flows into one. So for example, if you are looking at the risks faced by different components and elements of your organization, whether that's IT risk management, and therefore the threats to IT services and other similar associated services, whether it's facilities risk, risk to buildings, etc., all of those ultimately end up as dependencies for the business services and processes that your organizations conduct. So for us, they absolutely exist as a holistic framework. I think that has not historically been the case, that it's relatively new that a solution is available which covers all the different domains of operational risk. But certainly that is our position. So, sorry, Marzia, that's our sort of organizational continuity logic position on this, but let me hand over to you for a more sort of a practitioner perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question. And actually it's, Kapil, just let me know if I'm going down the wrong garden path here. It's actually one of the key, one of the reasons that people don't invest in BC software is because the organization is over-invested or invested already in other operational risk software, and there's no appetite to go and buy new software. So continuity logic aside, and I do like them as a product, but Paul will forgive me for saying this. Continuity logic aside, if you've got software that already manages business continuity functions, and there are many out there that can manage business continuity management, and that's the planning and compliance side of it, then my advice would always be to sweat the assets that you have, rather than spending more money on something shiny, which is going to take time to automate and time to train. If you're looking at starting an automation journey, start with what you've got, build it slowly, as I said, and then you'll get to a natural point where it no longer provides you with what you're looking for. And then you can look to spend more money on something more complex. If you look at the Gartner definition right now of resilience, if we go right back to the beginning of the conversation, we look at the difference between operational resilience and business continuity, where Gartner describes operational resilience as being a natural extension of business continuity, right? It fits what I'm trying to say, I think. BCM, and I think this is the what you're asking here, an existing operational risk framework with existing operational risk automation, trying to introduce automation for business continuity management. Absolutely. It's something that should be done. What I wouldn't recommend is that you duplicate things. So I've seen in the past business continuity and resilience teams trying to automate the business continuity and resilience function and getting to a point where they start duplicating the operational risk environment because they're needing to manage risks and controls, et cetera, on their own. So just as a final point from me, yes, it can be done. It needs to be done in partnership. So operational risk and business continuity and resilience sometimes stand on different sides of the same playing field. Sometimes they're in direct conflict with each other. You've got to bring that conversation together. And just as a final point, in terms of integrating the automation together, try to integrate them. Operational risk software that you've got already employed in your organization can be leveraged and can be integrated with new or business continuity or resilience software. So if you want to really bring in a robust operational risk view and you want to employ new software for BC or resilience, have the conversation with your vendors about how you can actually knit it together in the background. I hope I've answered the question there.
I think as much as we have time for, Marzia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Kapil, if I haven't, just drop another line in the chat and I'll pick it up at the end if we've got some more time. But it is an interesting question. Okay, let's move on to the final section of the presentation. Right, that is reporting, dashboards, and visualizations. Okay, now this is actually often the tail end of any deployment, right? In order to produce reporting or dashboards, you have to have data in your application already. Ironically, it's one of the first things that people ask for. So in any RFP or in any conversation in terms of trying to gain stakeholder engagements in spending money, basically, they're going to ask you, well, what do I get out of it? What are the reports that I can get out of it? So this is a conversation. We could have 3 hours conversation just about reporting on its own. So again, we'll take any questions. The reporting in this context is anything that the application can spit out. There is absolutely no point in putting loads of data into an application if you can't get it out. Okay. So in this particular context, we're talking about any extraction of any data in any format, be it something that you can print or be it something that you can show on a screen. Again, the examples are myriad, right? Any written documents. Paul already showed you in his original presentation the ability to create a business recovery plan. This is one of the, this and test reports, for example, are one of the most basic things you're going to have to produce. Dashboards. A dashboard being different from a deck, and I always bring this difference into play. A dashboard is something that you can show to an executive, be it on a PowerPoint slide that you've cut out of a system, or in a more relevant way, something that you can bring up on a screen and show current status of something. So it's a pre-configured screen or shot of reporting that is not a PowerPoint slide. Okay, whereas a deck is a PowerPoint slide. This is the type of thing that you need to be able to extract into presentations. Okay, and the two are different because dashboards tend to be incredibly simple views of very complex data, where people need to be able to, or people are going to ask you to drill down into the information. So pick part of it and move into the detail. Whereas a deck often has very, very complex context put in words by the person doing the presentation. Right? Both of those are examples of software output. Okay, analytics. Right. This is the fun stuff. Right. This is the stuff that resilience and BC SMEs and teams really get interested in. They know that there's value in being able to prove certain things or answer certain questions for senior stakeholders, but being able to delve into the detail and ask what if questions. What if I lose such and such? What if I have to shut down this building and suddenly move into a distributed operations scenario? What if I have to deploy work from home for 650 people? all those what if questions that you can ask of bringing certain data points together. That's where the fun is. So, I mean, I could go on for ages about this. I won't. Again, just in terms of this, why do we do, well, I mean, reporting in terms of incident response and incident management is obvious, right? In the event of an incident, as Paul showed you with your mobile device, excuse me, you need immediate access to data that's relevant, up-to-date, and trustworthy. Okay, if you cannot respond and recover faster than your competitors, if you cannot respond and recover in a way that people trust, you're in trouble. Okay, and then from a customer point of view, obviously, if you can prove, or you have a proven track record of being able to manage incidents efficiently and well, you know, we were talking about competitive advantage right at the beginning, right? That's one of the key focuses of being able to do BC and resilience well. Right, so we'll come back into some of the nitty-gritty of reports. I'm a little bit conscious of time at this point, so I'm going to hand straight back to Paul, who's got some examples of actual reporting. Now, this is actually one of those things, just before Paul starts, where you can manage all the other things that we've spoken about. So you can manage data capture manually. You can, to some degree, manage triggers and rules manually, where you've got a calendar, where you're using, you know, other mechanisms to drive the program management and program compliance. Reporting is interesting because you will get to a point where manual processes can no longer do the heavy lifting on data that a piece of software can. Okay, so I'm hoping that Paul's able to demonstrate some of that to you today, and that makes sense. And we'll come back to some lessons learned as soon as he's finished. Paul, back to you.
Thank you, Marzia. So this is my favorite bit of any software solution, is the value you get out at the end through the reporting mechanism. I'm going to skip through this stuff because, as Marzia said, we are in actual fact surprisingly up against it in terms of time. At one point we thought we would be we'd be finished early, but we're not going to be. So I'm going to run through this, and these are showing examples of the types of reporting that will come from the Continuity Logic CL360 solution. So let me just run you through those. And the first that I'm going to show you is what we would call an internal report. So here you are looking at a listing here of many reports that are available within our solution. Some of these are delivered as part of a general delivery to every client. Others are built by us for clients, and others are built by clients for their own use. And this is pretty straightforward reporting. We've already seen an example of this in the report I showed 15 minutes ago, but here's an example of a report which is laying out the response to a business impacts assessment for different processes. So here we see finance is the process, here's the plan owner, it's a tier 2 process, and it's got a recovery time objective of 24 hours. And we see against the impact categories that we have defined for our organization what the different levels of input are over time, the total impact and the grand total. And that grand total may be used to calculate this recovery time objective. That depends on the rules that are set behind it. But the principle I'm showing you here is that it's very straightforward to design reports such as that, which give you the sort of information that you need to make some decisions and incorporate those into business continuity plans. You can then get more ambitious, and I love this kind of visualization capability because it allows you to get action and bring people behind a specific point of understanding that you want to get across, or use this kind of capability during an incident to help you manage your crisis. And I notice a fair number of people in the earlier poll said that their primary ambition for bringing in or looking at software automation was in order to better conduct and respond to crises. Now, one of the ways that software can help that is because all the dots have been joined, so every single aspect of the program is linked together, from the business service to the process to the individual software applications that support those processes, right down, if required, to the infrastructure upon which those software applications are run. It means that you can drill into that and understand consequences. Now, here's an interesting question. what is the consequence of a data center failing? Now, let's look at this, and this shows how the information types are linked together in the continuity logic solution. So what I'm going to be doing is selecting one of our data centers, which are listed here. I'm just hoping this is going to start. So the data center that I'm going to be looking at is London. So that's the one that I select, and I update my results based upon that. I could, if I wanted, bring in a second parameter here, which is to look at the overall revenue loss that would result from this, because you can incorporate financial values into this, because you know that the business services at the end of all this do have financial impacts and financial values associated with them. So I could actually ask this to be filtered by revenue loss, but in this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to show my London data center, and I'm going to start drilling in because we have lost this data center and we now want to understand what's going to go on. So the first thing it's going to show me is which particular servers do I have in this room or in this data center or in this rack, however the query had been phrased. And the size of the object indicates the number of applications running on that. So I'm interested in the Colab 01 application. And here I can see that these are the software applications, Charles River, Portfolio Manager, Gold Settlements, Express and Wire Transfer, that are running on that particular server. If I drill into that, I can see for Charles River, that is being used by just one process. It's being used by the client services process. And the client services process is being utilized, though, by 4 business services. So this is obviously a technology business example. So our app store uses the client services software app. Our customer loyalty program uses that, online purchasing and online support. So whilst it's just one application which is being utilized by one particular team or process, it is having an impact on 4 different business services. And then in this case, I can drill in further and understand the impact of that loss over time. And then by floating my cursor over that particular object, I can understand a whole lot of information about this chain of dependency. Now, this for me is the really exciting part of building, and this goes back to Kapil's question from earlier about linking this within an operational risk framework. Because you have all these different data feeds coming in to the same platform and all the objects in the data model are related to each other, these kind of visualization results can be harnessed for both understanding implications when an incident has occurred, and that's what this is for, or analyzing in advance the consequences of certain failures such that you're able to create and apply the right risk strategies to and workarounds and increase the resilience if that's appropriate, because you're understanding, hang on, if we lose this server, look at this concentration of risk in terms of going all the way down. There might only be one process that uses it, but look at the range of dependencies that we have across the board on this. So that, I think, is a very powerful model, that ability to visualize. And there are many different types of visualization that can be used. Another one that I particularly like, and this is one that Marzia and I were reviewing yesterday for a different purpose. This is a way of understanding application concentration. So here what we're saying is that we have an organization that has different departments. This is a healthcare example, in actual fact. So this inner ring represents the different departments or different institutes within a healthcare organization. So we've got clinical transformation represented in the dark green here. We've got a particular hospital represented by that segment, another medical center represented by that, etc., etc. And it's showing us that across this, of course, 100% of our software applications are being used by this particular part of our business. But if we drill into that, we can then divide that down. So we're now saying that for this particular part, for clinical transformation, this depends on and utilizes 60% almost of our total software applications are used by the clinical transformation department. And we can then move out to the departments within this overall part of our organization. So now we've got clinical risk management here. and other departments. There we've got quality data registries, safety event reporting, and we can now see within clinical transformation, we can look at individual departments and see what their total application exposure is. And then outside of this, we come to processes within these departments. So now we're looking at the safety event investigation process within clinical risk management, which is within the clinical transformation unit. And that allows us to drill right down and to understand, in this case, the answer to a question of what is the breadth of use of our total estate of software applications across the different parts of our organization. And as I say, that is a visualization that I think is particularly useful in all sorts of scenarios. The final thing I want to show here is an example of how you get further capabilities if you have a data science part of your organization. Now, many of the clients that we talk to, particularly the larger clients, have a data analytics solution embedded in their organization. Maybe it's Power BI, which is what you're seeing in front of you here now. Maybe it's Cognos, maybe it's Click, maybe it's Tableau. And what you can do with our solution is you can, using data APIs, you can integrate and synchronize the data within the continuity logic operational resilience solution within that data lake, which may be analyzed and may, in your organization, pull in data from other sources as well. And this then gives you a range of other visualizations that you can use. And I'm just showing some snippet examples of those sort of visualizations here. Geographic location ones are particularly useful. And here we have application, and then finally third parties. And it allows you to drill into this. And we could spend probably 20 minutes on each of these, and we don't have that time. But what I'm trying to do is get across really here the scope of visualization capability that is made available to our clients via the continuity logic solution, and the power that that can bring to you. Marzia, that's for me. Back to you.
Thanks, Paul. Right, let's get the slideshow back up and running again. All right, I mean, just before we crack on, one of the things that Paul's mentioned, and I think let's just take a step back again, for those of you that might be slightly overwhelmed by the amount of data that you're seeing on that screen. Paul's actually walked you through an evolution of very, I don't want to say basic, but of fairly basic or relatively basic reporting all the way through to the ultimate. So it all depends on the wealth of data or the richness of data, as you said, that you're sitting on. But there is no reason to think that you can't get there slowly. And we'll get back to that. But you can also, as much as you can start your automation of your processes, your rules, your triggers slowly, you can also start your reporting slowly and build them up over time.
Marzia, can I just come in here?
Yes.
Chantal does want us to finish on time, which I think is fair, and she does want a group photograph at the end where we all turn our cameras on so she can take that group photograph. So if we can just make sure that we are winding up within actually no more than 5 minutes from now, that would be perfect.
All right, that sounds good. Hussein, the cost part of the software, I think let's keep that to an aside. If we don't have enough time to answer that, Paul, I'm sure you can get a hold of Hussein offline. And
yeah, that's a separate conversation, of course, yeah.
Okay. Right, so let's move on. Again, let's work through some lessons learned. Reporting is a vast conversation, right? So I'm going to walk through this fairly quickly. The first thing I can tell you to do, or I can advise you to do, is before you start any software or start exploring any software automation, understand your big questions. So if your big questions are, as Paul demonstrated, what is the risk of losing data sensors if they're particularly at risk? If they are, to understand compliance or key risk indicators, whatever those big questions are, understand what they are, because they will allow you to shape your first conversations with vendors, but they also allow you to have some sort of a direction. You know where you're trying to get to. And if you know that, then you can build out a change process. Right? Get a senior sponsor on board. This sounds trite, or it sounds like a no-brainer, but actually, senior sponsors that don't have a voice in what it is that they are asking you for in terms of dashboards and decks are actually a problem. So get a senior sponsor involved and get them involved in the change conversation. Okay. Understand that it doesn't matter how clever your software is, it doesn't matter how complex or mature your program is, somebody will always want a spreadsheet. Okay, you will always need a spreadsheet, so build that in. Just bite the bullet and find a way to deliver everything that you've got onto spreadsheet. Okay. Again, we've gone through this, right? Agile approaches work for reporting as well. People, as they get used to the idea that reporting is possible, they are going to ask you for more and more and more. So start small, introduce the idea of reporting, and you'll find that reporting evolves as one of the fastest things that evolve in a program. Okay, we've looked at big data quality demands and the risks of not having good data in your system. Okay, get involved in those data quality conversations, get ahead of the game if you can. Again, to talk to integration of data executives, and let's talk to the operational risk conversation in a way. If you're looking at an operational risk function, that's looking at location risk, supply risk, people risk, premises risk, etc., etc. You cannot anymore afford to have different reports with different answers going to the same audience. Okay, engagement across data owners. This is especially true of slightly more mature automation discussions and programs. Engagement with data owners and actually working to a common goal. I can't sell that hard enough. Right? The problems that you will have if you're looking at disparate data sources, they're impossible to overcome. Okay. Again, as Paul said, the continuity logic software integrates with all manner of reporting, from Click to Power BI to Tableau. If you've got Click, Power BI, Tableau employed in your organization already, don't go out and buy something new. Okay, use what you've got, especially if the integration is available, especially if you've already got an audience that's used to using them. Okay, if you don't have anything, buy one piece of software that does everything. Right? Don't buy two pieces of software if you can buy one piece of software that does the reporting and the data gathering for you. Okay, and then the final point, this is a long game. Okay, so if you can understand to some degree where it is you're going in 2, 3, 4 years from now, then building an agile conversation actually becomes easier. If you try and build everything all at once, you'll never be able to define this. Okay, and I'm going to whiz across because I know that we want to do that photo just before we wrap up. There was a question that came through on email before we started on a return on investment reports and how you actually get stakeholders and senior executives to buy into to investments. So just a very, very quick note on this. Return on investment from a software point of view, from automation point of view, actually, I've never seen this done in a way that you can simply say the software will pay for itself in 2, 3, 4 years. And that's because bringing or quantifying the effort involved in a business resilience team in doing all of the compliance and reporting and thinking work is actually very hard. So just a very quick note on return on investment conversations. You're going to have to put it into quantifiable and non-quantifiable or tangible and intangible elements as far as you can. But if you can start the conversation by asking, what's the advantage of doing this? So where am I going to save time? Often it's just effort. It's the number of hours that people spend doing certain reporting. And sometimes you can quantify that when board reports take 40 hours out of every quarter, for example, to put together. If you can quantify things, quantify them. Sometimes it's just, what am I going to save in terms of effort or funding or risk, for example, lowering risk that's being managed from a regulatory or an audit point of view. And then answering the question, what if I don't do this? So what's the risk? What's the impact of not doing this? It's a very bad answer in a very short space of time. I do apologize. If you want to come to me afterwards or separately, please do. But that's what I would advise. Okay. And finally, that's it. So we've spoken a heck of a lot today, over 3 hours. We've done a lot of demonstrations, and I realize it's been a lot of information. So just to summarize, right, it doesn't matter who you are, what your program looks like, how you integrate with operational resilience, how you integrate across the various resilience pillars, right? You are more than just compliance teams, and you need to, you can be contributing a lot to organizational strategy decisions, right? Automation of this is applicable to all of you. We've distilled those into the 3 areas in some degree of detail. And then the final point, software can deliver all of this, okay, but it's not an intelligent animal. right? Software can only do this for your organizations if you introduce it and manage it effectively. And I would add to that, do it slowly and in a considered fashion. And that's a wrap. Paul, I don't think we have time for any questions other than a photograph.
I think that is absolutely right. So thank you, Marzia. So please, if you are able, turn on your camera. I know that Chantal would love to get a group photograph. It's the first time I've seen this being done, but I think it's a wonderful idea. So if you can't do that, then don't do it. But if you can, then what a nice thing. Marvelous. Hello, everybody.
Let me stop sharing.
I think that might be about it, Chantal. If you want to take your photograph, I know one or two more appearing.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah,
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And just, Chantal, just to finish this off, I will be sending you these slides in case you want to share these on.
Sure. More people are coming in.
Thanks very much.